The Idrani Account, translated and annotated by the Ashworth Institute for Exohistorical Studies, New Cambridge, Earth 4619 CE. Catalog reference EH44017R.
Translator's Preface. The following account has been translated into Earth Standard, Old English, by the Ashworth Institute for Exohistorical Studies. Alien designations, ranks, units of measurement, and cultural concepts have been converted into their nearest familiar equivalents where possible. Certain terms with no direct human analog have been annotated in footnotes. An unabridged translation with original nomenclature is available through the Institute's archive at New Cambridge, catalog reference EH44017R. Measurements of time have been standardized to Earth-relative years, days, and hours. Where the original text references alien temporal units, the conversion reflects the best consensus of the Institute's Temporal Equivalence Working Group, whose methodology is described in Hargrove and Amp. OSI, Reconciling Alien Chronologies, New Cambridge University Press, 4619 CE. Ranks and titles have been mapped to their nearest equivalents in the historical naval traditions of pre-unification Earth. While no translation of alien military hierarchy can be exact, the Institute believes these approximations preserve the functional relationships, chains of command, relative authority, and institutional culture better than any invented terminology would. A full concordance of original ranks to their translated equivalents appears in Appendix C. Personal names deserve particular note. The species represented in this account employ naming conventions with no direct parallel in human cultures, and each species follows distinct traditions that the Institute has endeavored to preserve in translation. The Orenai, the species to which the account's author belongs, follow a convention in which an individual is identified by personal name and current institutional posting. For the Orenai, identity is defined by service. You are where you work, and as your assignment changes, so does the way you are formally introduced. This reflects a culture that values contribution over lineage, and regards the preservation and organization of knowledge as the highest form of civic duty. An Orenai introduced as Idrani assigned to the Naval Archives at Tanis Station would, upon reassignment, adopt her new posting as part of her name. In informal contexts and throughout this account, she is referred to simply as Idrani. Among the Sathari, the ancient civilization whose observation records form the historical backdrop of this account, individuals are identified by personal name followed by an institutional or scholarly affiliation, the research house, conservatory, or academic lineage to which they belong. This reflects a culture in which intellectual tradition carries greater social weight than familial descent. The Sathari, introduced as Jacques Vun of the Tisarn Conservatory, would subsequently be referred to as Jacques. The Rethani, who constitute the primary military species of the Alliance and make up the majority of the expedition's crew, follow a regional origin convention, identifying themselves by personal name and home province or territory. Military personnel add rank as a prefix in professional contexts. Other Alliance species employ still other conventions, each noted on first occurrence in the text. In all cases, the transliterations chosen by the Institute prioritize consistency and readability. The original phonetic structures are, for most of the species represented, physically impossible for human vocal anatomy to reproduce with accuracy. Where a name's cultural or etymological significance is relevant, this has been noted. The Institute wishes to emphasize that this document is a historical account, not a diplomatic text. Views, assumptions, and conclusions expressed within it are those of its author and do not represent the positions of the Terran Federal Commonwealth, the Ashworth Institute, or any affiliated body. Readers seeking the Commonwealth's official assessment of the events described herein are directed to the Parliamentary Record of the First Contact Commission, Sessions 4401 through 4438 CE, available through the Commonwealth Archives. A note on provenance. A note on chronology is necessary before proceeding. The events Sub-Lieutenant Idrani describes took place between 4398 and 4399 CE. and she composed her account in the months immediately following. The document did not reach human hands until 4404 CE, some 6 years later, and this present translation was not completed until 4619 CE, more than 2 centuries after the events themselves. The account that follows, then, is a contemporary record of its own time, recovered afterward and translated later still. Where the narrative speaks in the present tense, that present belongs to Idrani, not to the reader. This account came into human possession during the 3rd year of formal diplomatic relations between the Terran Federal Commonwealth and the Interstellar Governance Alliance, in circumstances that deserve brief explanation. In 4404 CE, the Commonwealth's diplomatic mission to the Alliance capital at Tanis Station requested access to any Alliance records pertaining to Earth or its inhabitants. The request was made under Article 7 of the Provisional Framework for Information Exchange, which both parties had ratified the previous year. It was expected to yield little. Humanity's existence had been unknown to the broader Alliance for millennia, and it was assumed that whatever records existed would be sparse. A survey entry here, a catalog notation there, the bureaucratic residue of a civilization that had noted Earth's coordinates in passing and moved on. The Alliance's response took 4 months. When it arrived, it filled 11 data modules in a storage format that predated the Alliance itself. The bulk of the material consisted of observational records spanning approximately 74,000 Earth-relative years, compiled by the Sathari Directorate for Exoplanetary Survey, a scientific body of the Sathari civilization that preceded and was eventually absorbed into the Alliance. These records documented periodic surveys of Earth conducted at irregular intervals from the late Pleistocene to the 24th century CE. Their contents, which included detailed biological, geological, and cultural observations of humanity across nearly the full span of its development as a species, have been published separately by the Institute as the Sathari Observation Logs, EH4401-1A, through EH44016F. The final module, however, was different. It was not a survey record. It was a personal account written by a junior Alliance naval officer named, in our transliteration, Idrani. Sub-Lieutenant Idrani was Orenai, a species whose members served throughout the Alliance as archivists, analysts, and information specialists. She had been assigned as record specialist aboard the Alliance vessel Threshold, a reconnaissance ship dispatched to the Sol sector in 4398 CE to assess the status of a species that had been under formal quarantine for over 2,000 years and unmonitored for the last 1,500. The selection of an Orenai officer for this role was, by all indications, routine. The Orenai have served as the Alliance's institutional memory for centuries, cataloging, cross-referencing, and preserving the vast informational infrastructure upon which the Alliance depends. That an Orenai analyst would be attached to an expedition requiring deep archival expertise was unremarkable. That this particular Orenai would produce the most significant document in the history of interspecies relations was not presumably anticipated. Sub-Lieutenant Idrani composed her account over a period of 8 months following the Threshold's return to Alliance space. It was submitted to the Alliance Naval Intelligence Directorate as a supplementary appendix to the expedition's official after-action report. According to Alliance archival records, the after-action report itself was classified at the highest level of restriction and seen by fewer than 30 individuals. Idrani's supplementary account, deemed personal in nature and therefore outside classification protocols, was filed in a secondary archive and, by all available evidence, largely forgotten. It was included in the data transfer to the Commonwealth, apparently by accident. The Institute does not believe the Alliance intended for this document to reach human hands. Its inclusion among the 11 data modules appears to have been an administrative error. Idrani's account was stored adjacent to the Sathari observation logs in the Alliance's archival system, and the retrieval query that compiled the transfer package did not distinguish between the ancient survey records and the modern appendix attached to the same sector file. Whatever the cause, the document is now part of the human historical record. The Alliance has not requested its return, nor has it commented publicly on its release. Draw from that what conclusions you will. What follows is Sub-Lieutenant Idrani's account in its entirety, translated and annotated by the Ashworth Institute. It begins with her assignment to the Alliance Naval Archives at Tanis Station, approximately 6 months before the Threshold's departure, and ends with the expedition's return. It is, to the Institute's knowledge, the only surviving first-person narrative of humanity's first contact with an alien civilization, written from the other side. It is also, the Institute believes, the most honest one. Dr. Eleanor Hargrove, Director, Ashworth Institute for Exohistorical Studies, New Cambridge, Earth, 4619 CE.
Chapter 1. The Quiet Work. I have thought for some time about where to begin this account. The obvious place would be the moment I found the file. The quarantine flag, the sector designation, the first entry in the observation log. That is the moment everything changed. But it would be dishonest to start there, because it would suggest that I understood the significance of what I had found. I did not. Not at first. The truth is less dramatic. I found the file the same way I found everything in the Naval Archives. Methodically, without expectation, in the course of work that no one else considered important. I should explain the archives, because they are essential to understanding how a file of this magnitude could go unnoticed for as long as it did. Tanis Station is the administrative capital of the Alliance, and it is enormous. I do not use that word loosely. The station occupies a stable orbital position above the Rethany homeworld, and its outer ring alone, the governmental and diplomatic quarter, could house the entire population of a mid-tier Orenai city. Below the outer ring are the military levels: Fleet Command, Strategic Operations, Naval Intelligence, the Admiralty offices. Below those are the support levels: Engineering, Logistics, Communications, Medical. And below everything else, in a section of the station's lower core that most personnel have no reason to visit and some do not know exists, are the Naval Archives. I arrived at Tanis Station on a routine transfer. My previous posting had been the Orenai Archival Collegium at Verith, a civilian institution and a prestigious one by Orenai standards, though I doubt anyone outside our species had heard of it. I had spent 3 years there cataloging colonial-era survey records, which is considered meaningful work among my people, and I had done it well. My reward, as these things tend to work in the Alliance, was a military posting. I should be careful here. The Alliance does not mistreat the Orenai. We are valued. The word is used frequently in official communications. Valued contributors, valued partners, valued members of the Alliance community. Our skills are recognized as essential. The Rethani, who administer the Alliance military and hold most of its senior positions, freely acknowledge that their institutional memory would collapse without Orenai archivists maintaining it. We are told this often, usually in the same conversation in which we are told that a particular assignment is an opportunity. The Naval Archives at Tanis Station was an opportunity. In practice, what this meant was that I was given a workspace in a low-ceiling section of the station's lower core, 3 levels below the nearest mess hall, and 2 levels below the nearest compartment occupied by anyone who was not also Orenai. The environmental controls in the archives were set to Rethani standard, warmer than I preferred, with a faint metallic taste to the recycled air that I never fully stopped noticing. My workspace had been furnished with a console and chair designed for Rethani proportions, which meant the seat was too deep and the console surface too high. I requested an adjustment. The request was logged. 17 days later, a maintenance technician arrived with an Orenai specification chair, apologized for the delay, and explained that they had needed to construct one because there was no stock on this level. I tell you this not to complain. I tell you because it illustrates something about the archives that matters. They were not a place the Alliance thought about. The station's upper levels were maintained to exacting standards. The Admiralty offices gleamed. The council chambers were climate-controlled to accommodate every species simultaneously. But the archives were infrastructure, necessary, funded, and ignored. They existed because regulations required them to exist. No one with authority over resource allocation had ever been there. My assignment was to catalog pre-Alliance data modules. This requires some explanation. When the Alliance was formed in the aftermath of the Rashani crisis, the series of cascading disasters that collapsed the old political order and killed, by the most conservative estimates, 11 billion people across 4 systems. The surviving civilizations brought their institutional records into the new administrative structure. This was a condition of membership. All archives were to be unified, cross-referenced, and made accessible through the Alliance's information systems. It was an admirable goal. It was also, for certain categories of records, never completed. The Sathari had been the most prolific record keepers of the pre-Alliance era, and their archives were vast. Survey records, observational logs, planetary assessments, biological catalogs, thousands of years of methodical scientific documentation stored in data formats that the Sathari had developed for their own systems and that were not natively compatible with Alliance infrastructure. Converting them required specialized knowledge of Sathari encoding protocols, a working familiarity with their taxonomic conventions, and the patience to process records one module at a time, verifying each entry against the original before approving it for integration. It was, in other words, Orenai work. It had been Orenai work for decades, passed from one archivist to the next as each completed their tour and was rotated to a new posting. Progress was slow because the volume was immense and because no one was in a hurry. The pre-Alliance records were historical curiosities at best. Nothing in them had operational relevance. Nothing in them affected current policy, current strategy, or current deployments. The work existed because the work existed, and it continued because stopping it would have required someone with authority to make a decision about something they did not care about. I did not mind it. I want to be honest about that. The Rathani officers who occasionally visited the archives, my nominal supervisor, Lieutenant Commander Torshan from Kelvani Province, came by once every 10 days or so to sign off on my progress reports. Clearly thought the assignment was tedious. Torshan was professional and not unkind, but he looked at the racks of unconverted Sathari data modules, the way a person looks at a task they are glad belongs to someone else. He would ask if I needed anything, sign whatever I put in front of him, and leave. But the work suited me. There is a particular satisfaction in opening a data module that has not been accessed in centuries and making its contents legible again. Each Sathari survey record was a small window into a civilization that no longer existed in its original form. Their methods, their priorities, what they considered worth documenting. I liked the Sathari. I never met one, of course. By the time I was born, the Sathari had been part of the Alliance for generations, their institutions absorbed, their traditions blended into the larger administrative culture, until only traces remained. But in their records, they were still themselves, precise, curious, thorough. They cataloged everything and judged nothing, at least not in their official documentation. A planet was not good or bad, useful or useless. It was observed, it was measured, it was recorded. I spent 4 months working through geological survey modules from the Sathari Directorate, for exoplanetary survey before I found anything unusual. SSL. The standard format for a Sathari planetary survey was consistent across the entire archive. A header block identifying the system, stellar classification, orbital bodies, the survey vessel's designation, the date of observation in Sathari temporal notation. Then the body: atmospheric composition, geological assessment, hydrological data, magnetic field measurements, biological indicators, if applicable. Most entries were brief. Most systems were unremarkable. A star, some rocks, perhaps a gas giant. Nothing alive. The Sathari documented them all with the same care, the same format, the same clinical precision. I had processed hundreds of them. They were as familiar to me as my own handwriting. The file I opened on the morning of my 123rd day at Tanis Station began the same way. A system header, an unremarkable star, main sequence, middle-aged, stable output, several orbital bodies. One of them fell within the habitable margin, which was not uncommon in Sathari surveys. They had surveyed thousands of systems, and a meaningful percentage contained at least one planet with conditions theoretically capable of supporting carbon-based biology. The geological assessment was where the format first deviated. Under standard Sathari protocol, geological data occupied a single section of the survey: tectonic status, volcanic activity index, crustal composition, core dynamics. Routine measurements, rarely longer than a few hundred data lines. This entry's geological section was enormous. It ran to thousands of lines and contained multiple sub-entries spanning what appeared to be different observation periods. The Sathari survey team had returned to this planet more than once. That was unusual. Sathari surveys were, as a rule, single-visit assessments. A ship arrived, observed, documented, and moved on. Return visits required justification, a formal amendment to the survey schedule, approved by the Directorate. They happened, but rarely, and usually only for systems with significant resource potential or unusual stellar phenomena. This was neither. The star was ordinary, the system was ordinary, but the survey team had come back. I looked at the observation dates. The first entry was very old. Even by Sathari standards, it was ancient. The time conversion was imprecise, but it corresponded to roughly 74,000 years before the present era. The most recent entry in the geological section was dated to approximately the 24th century of the current era. The survey team, or rather, successive survey teams, because no crew could possibly span that duration, had been observing this planet intermittently for over 70 millennia. I set down what I was working on, not abruptly. I'm Orenai. We do not work abruptly. But I remember the precise moment I stopped processing the module I had been converting and gave this file my full attention, because something in the back of my mind had shifted from routine to alert. I checked the file's classification tags. Every Sathari survey record carried a standardized set: system coordinates, survey priority level, resource assessment, biological status. This file had all of those. It also had one I had never seen before: a quarantine flag. I had processed hundreds of Sathari survey files. I had read the Directorate's procedural documentation. I had studied their classification system in detail as part of my training at the Collegium. I knew every standard tag in the Sathari survey taxonomy. Quarantine was not among them. The flag was not part of the original survey format. It had been added later, appended to the file in a subsequent modification, using a classification protocol that I did not recognize. It was not Cathari, or rather, it was not standard Cathari. The encoding was consistent with Cathari-era systems, but the tag itself appeared to have been created specifically for this file. Someone had invented a new classification category for whatever this planet represented. I cross-referenced the system coordinates against the Alliance's current navigational charts. The sector existed, it was mapped, but it was listed as unsurveyed, uninhabited, and unclaimed. There were no Alliance installations, no monitoring stations, no traffic routes passing through it. On the current charts, it was empty space. I searched for any record of quarantine beacons deployed to the sector. The standard Alliance procedure for restricted zones is to deploy automated warning beacons at the sector's navigational boundaries, transponders that broadcast on all standard frequencies, advising approaching vessels to alter course. Every active quarantine zone in Alliance space has them. They are logged, maintained, and periodically inspected. There were no beacons registered to this sector. None active, none decommissioned, none on record at all. I sat with this for some time. And Orenai does not panic. This is not a boast, it is closer to a limitation. My species processes discomfort slowly, almost reluctantly, as though our nervous systems prefer to exhaust every alternative interpretation before allowing us to feel alarm. What I felt, sitting in my too-warm workspace in the lower levels of Tanis Station, was not fear or excitement. It was a professional unease, the particular disquiet an archivist feels when the records do not agree with each other. A quarantine had been placed on this sector. It was not in the Alliance's active records. The beacons were gone. The sector was listed as empty. And the file itself, the Cathari observation log, was 74,000 years deep and had never been converted, cross-referenced, or integrated into the Alliance information system. It had been sitting in an unconverted data module in the lower archives of Tanis Station, in a format that only an Orenai specialist could read, for what appeared to be the entire duration of the Alliance's existence. No one knew it was there, or if they had known once, they had forgotten. I should have continued with my standard cataloging work. The module I had been converting was half finished, and Torshan would expect it in his next progress report. The correct procedure was to flag the anomalous file for review, note it in my daily log, and continue with the assigned task. Someone with appropriate authority would assess the flag in due course. Instead, I opened the first observation entry. ? The entry was authored by a survey team leader, identified as Veneth, of the Cardassian Institute, a Cathari academic affiliation I was not familiar with, though the Cardassian name appeared in several other survey files from the same era. The date, as I have said, converted to approximately 74,000 years before the present. Veneth's initial observations were consistent with standard Cathari survey protocol. Atmospheric analysis, hydrological mapping, magnetic field assessment. The planet was geologically active, substantially more so than most habitable margin worlds in the Cathari catalog. Veneth noted this with the clinical interest of a scientist encountering a data point outside the expected range. Active tectonics, significant volcanic potential, an unusually large natural satellite for a planet of its mass. Axial tilt sufficient to produce pronounced seasonal variation. The planet was, by the Cathari's own metrics, toward the extreme end of geological volatility for a world capable of supporting complex life. Veneth also noted the presence of a pre-technological species. Tool use had been observed, social grouping behavior. No permanent settlements, no agriculture, no evidence of structural construction. The species was classified as pre-sapient or early sapient. The Sathari had a graded scale, and this species fell near the boundary. Veneth recorded it the way the Sathari recorded everything, without judgment, a data point, a notation in the biological census of a geologically interesting planet. Then the survey team documented a volcanic event. I am not a geologist. I do not have the training to fully contextualize what the Sathari instruments recorded. But the numbers did not require specialized knowledge to understand. The eruption originated from a caldera structure in the planet's equatorial region, and the Sathari's yield estimates placed it at the upper boundary of their measurement scale. Veneth's team recorded atmospheric particulate densities, thermal disruption patterns, and projected climate effects. Their models predicted a sustained period of environmental collapse, a reduction in surface temperature severe enough to destroy most of the planet's existing ecosystems. Veneth's final notation in this entry was brief. I will reproduce it as closely as translation allows. Projected survival probability for the observed pre-sapient species, negligible. Recommend file classification be updated to geological interest only. Biological census to be confirmed as extinct on next scheduled survey of this sector. That was the end of the first entry. Routine. A planet had suffered a catastrophic volcanic event, and a minor species was expected to die. The Sathari had seen it before. The galaxy is not gentle with its experiments. I scrolled to the second entry. The date converted to approximately 10,000 years before the present era. A gap of some 64,000 years. A new survey team. A new author. Salachi of the Vethane Conservatory. Different academic lineage, different generation, different century. But the same planet. Salachi had been sent to confirm the extinction. The entry began with updated geological readings, atmospheric composition, climate data. The planet had recovered as planets do, though the scars of the eruption were still visible in the geological record. The ecosystems had rebuilt, shifted, adapted. Salachi noted all of this with professional thoroughness. Then, Salachi reached the biological census, and the tone of the entry changed. I have read thousands of Sathari survey documents. Their language is remarkably consistent across centuries and authors. A shared scientific vocabulary, an institutional voice that suppresses individual perspective in favor of collective precision. It is one of the things I admire about them. But Salachi's entry, beginning with the biological census, was different. The vocabulary was the same, the format was the same, but there was something underneath it, visible only if you had read enough Sathari documents to recognize the baseline from which this one deviated. The species was still there, not merely present, not clinging to existence in some remnant population in a sheltered corner of the planet. The species had survived the volcanic winter, survived the ecosystem collapse, survived 64,000 years of a planet that was, by any reasonable measure, trying to kill them. And they had changed. Salachi documented permanent settlements, agriculture, domesticated animal species, tools of increasing complexity, social structures that had moved well beyond simple grouping behavior into something the Sathari classification system did not have an adequate category for. Salachi spent 4 times the standard survey duration at the planet. The entry was the longest single observation in the Directorate's records for that era. And at the end of it, Salachi made a recommendation that I had never seen in any other Sathari survey file. Recommend reclassification from geological interest to priority monitoring. Schedule follow-up survey at reduced interval. This species requires further observation. I stared at the screen for a long time after reading that. The archives were quiet, as they always were. The ventilation system hummed its low, constant note. Somewhere above me, several levels up, the Alliance went about its business. Fleet deployments, trade negotiations, council sessions, the vast and complicated machinery of interstellar governance. None of it knew what was sitting in the unconverted data modules in the lower core. I checked the time. I had been reading for 6 hours. My shift had ended 2 hours ago. I saved my place in the file, secured my workstation, and left the archives. I walked to the mess hall on the level above mine and ate a meal I do not remember tasting. I returned to my quarters and lay in the dark for a long time, thinking. The file contained dozens more entries, thousands of years of observation, compressed into data modules that no one had opened in centuries. A species that should have died and didn't. A quarantine flag that someone had considered important enough to invent a new classification for. And a sector that the Alliance's current charts said was empty. I went back to the archives the next morning. I told myself I would finish the entry I had been converting. The routine geological survey, the one Torsion was expecting. I sat down at my console, opened the half-finished conversion, and looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I opened the quarantine file and kept reading. Chapter 2. 70,000 years in 11 days. It took me 11 days to read the complete file. I say this knowing it sounds slow. The Sithari were thorough, but most of their entries were compact. A few hundred lines of data, a brief analytical summary, a recommendation for the next scheduled survey. An experienced Orenai archivist could process several in an afternoon. But this file was not like the others. Not because of its length, though it was longer than anything else in the archive. It was not like the others because of what happened to me while I was reading it. I need to be precise about this. I am not speaking about an emotional reaction, not in the way the Rithani would mean it. The Orenai do not experience information the way other species do. For us, data is not a stimulus, it is a landscape. We move through it the way other species move through physical space, and when we encounter something unexpected, we do not startle. We orient, we stop, assess the new terrain, adjust our internal models, and proceed. It is a slow process. It is also, I have been told, somewhat unnerving to watch. What happened to me over those 11 days was that the landscape kept changing. Every time I oriented myself, every time I believed I understood what this file contained and what this species represented, the next entry shifted the ground. Not dramatically. The Sithari did not deal in drama, but persistently, relentlessly, across thousands of years of observation, the data refused to settle into a pattern I could hold. I will not reproduce every entry. The Ashworth Institute has published the complete Sithari observation logs separately, and they are available to anyone who wishes to read them. What I will describe is what I found as I found it. The entries that stopped me, the moments where I had to set down my work and recalibrate my understanding of what I was looking at. After Salachi's entry documenting the survival and the agriculture, the Directorate assigned a permanent monitoring schedule to the planet. The interval between visits shortened. Where the original gap between Veneth and Salachi had been 64,000 years, the next visit came within 3,000, then 2,000, then 1,000. By the time the observation record reached what I have since learned to call the Bronze Age, the Sithari were sending survey ships every few centuries. The entries from this period were written by a rotating series of observers, each inheriting the file from their predecessor, each building on the accumulated record. The handoffs were meticulous. Sithari protocol required incoming observers to review the full history before conducting their own survey, so that continuity of analysis would be maintained across generations. This meant that by the time an observer reached the planet, They had already read everything their predecessors had written. They arrived knowing the species should have been extinct. They arrived knowing it wasn't. What they found, visit after visit, was escalation. The species had not simply survived. It had organized itself into complex hierarchical societies, multiple separate civilizations, in fact, developing independently across different regions of the planet, each with distinct languages, customs, architectural traditions, and governance structures. The Sathari documented cities, roads, irrigation systems, metallurgy, written language appearing independently in at least 4 separate locations. The observer from this period, Tessith of the Cardassian Institute, a direct academic descendant of the original survey leader Veneth, noted that the rate of development was, by comparison to every other sapient species in the Sathari catalog, significantly accelerated. Development rate falls outside projected parameters, Tessith wrote. No species in the current catalog has achieved multi-regional, independent civilization development within this timeframe following a near-extinction event. Recommend continued monitoring with increased observational detail. Then, within the span of a single observation interval, several of those civilizations collapsed. The Sathari observer who documented this, Orath of the Pellenay Conservatory, arrived expecting to update a record as continued expansion. Instead, Orath found ruins, trade networks dissolved, cities abandoned, the written records of multiple societies simply stopped. The causes appeared to be a combination of factors: climate disruption, resource depletion, migration pressure, the severing of interdependent economic systems. Orath catalogued the collapse with the same precision the Sathari applied to everything. But there was a note at the end of the entry that stayed with me long after I read it. Collapse of this scope typically represents a terminal trajectory for pre-spaceflight civilizations. However, given this species' prior recovery from the volcanic extinction event, definitive projections should be withheld, pending subsequent observation. The Sathari were learning caution. This species had already surprised them once. They were no longer willing to assume it was finished. They were right to wait. By the next observation, new civilizations had emerged from the ruins, different ones, some incorporating elements of what had come before, others developing along entirely new lines. The species had not merely recovered, it had diversified. Where the previous era had produced a handful of dominant cultures, the post-collapse period generated dozens, spreading across the planet's surface in overlapping, competing, cooperating waves of expansion. I was 3 days into the file at this point. I had stopped pretending to work on the standard cataloging. Set. The entries from the next several thousand years, the period I now understand to encompass classical antiquity and the medieval era, were where the Sathari observation record became something more than a survey log. The observers were still Sathari, the format was still standardized, but the content expanded beyond biological and geological metrics into territory that the Directorate's original protocols had never been designed to capture. The observers began documenting cultural output, philosophy, mathematics, architectural engineering, systems of law and governance, artistic traditions. This was unusual. The Sathari were scientists. Their survey protocols were designed to measure a planet's physical and biological characteristics, not to assess a species' intellectual development. But the observers assigned to this planet kept exceeding their briefs, and the Directorate kept approving the expanded reports. Something about this species compelled the Sathari to look more closely, to document more thoroughly, to try to understand not just what the species was doing, but why. The difficulty was that the why never resolved into a coherent answer. The same civilizations that produced sophisticated mathematical proofs also practiced ritual sacrifice. The same societies that built architectural works of extraordinary precision and beauty also maintained systems of forced labor to build them. A species that had developed multiple independent traditions of ethical philosophy, frameworks for determining right action, for defining justice, for establishing the proper relationship between an individual and the community, simultaneously conducted organized warfare on a scale that increased with every observation. The observer who documented the period roughly corresponding to what I am told was the height of several major empires, Tessara of the Vithane Conservatory, wrote an analysis that ran 3 times the standard length. It was the first entry in the file that I would describe as conflicted, not in its conclusions, which were carefully hedged in proper Sathari fashion, but in its structure. Tessara kept circling back to the same contradiction, examining it from different angles, as though the act of describing it more precisely might resolve it. The species displays a cognitive capacity for abstract moral reasoning that exceeds any previously catalogued pre-spaceflight civilization. Simultaneously, it demonstrates a capacity for organized intraspecies violence that also exceeds any previously catalogued example. These characteristics do not appear to be inversely correlated. They appear to develop in parallel. The analytical framework currently available to the Directorate does not account for this. I read that passage 4 times. It is one thing to know, in the abstract, that a species is complex. It is another to watch a safari scientist, a representative of a civilization famous for its ability to categorize and classify the natural world, admit that their framework has failed. The observations continued. More wars, more philosophy. Plagues that killed vast percentages of the population, followed by periods of rebuilding that produced new innovations. Religious movements that inspired both extraordinary compassion and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes within the same generation. The observers noted all of it. The file grew. And then the entries reached the period that the Sathari stopped pretending to be objective about. I need to be careful with this section. What I read in those entries changed something in me. Not immediately, not the way the Rithani describe emotional impact, but in the slow Orenai way, the way a landscape shifts when you realize the mountain you have been walking toward is not a mountain. The observer was Carathan of the Tessarn Conservatory. The observation period corresponded to what I have since learned to call the early 20th century. Carathan arrived at the planet expecting the usual update: new technologies, new conflicts, the ongoing cycle of destruction and reconstruction that had characterized every previous visit. And in a sense, that is what Carathan found. But the scale had changed. The species had industrialized. The safari had observed other species make this transition. It was a recognized stage in civilizational development, the point at which a society begins to harness energy sources beyond biological muscle, and its productive capacity increases by orders of magnitude. It was normally accompanied by a period of rapid expansion, environmental disruption, and social reorganization. The Sathari had documented it before. They knew what it looked like. What they had not seen before was a species that industrialized its violence at the same rate it industrialized everything else. Carathan documented a conflict that spanned most of the planet's major civilizations simultaneously. The entry described chemical weapons deployed against massed formations of the species' own kind, substances designed specifically to damage respiratory systems, to burn exposed tissue, to cause slow and agonizing death. It described mechanized projectile weapons capable of killing hundreds per minute. It described the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, a concept that Carathan had to define, because the Sathari had no existing term for the organized killing of non-combatants by their own species. The conflict ended. Carathan noted the death toll, the territorial reorganizations, the economic devastation. And then, Carathan noted something else. The survivors had created an international body dedicated to preventing future conflicts of this magnitude. A diplomatic structure designed to resolve disputes without warfare. The species has responded to the largest organized intra-species conflict in its recorded history by constructing a mechanism for peace, Carathan wrote. Whether this represents a genuine developmental inflection point or a temporary deviation from established behavioral patterns cannot be determined from a single observation interval. Carathan recommended an accelerated follow-up survey. The Directorate approved it. The next observer arrived approximately 20 years later, well within Carathan's own lifetime. The same observer, in fact. Carathan returned personally. The peace mechanism had failed. A second conflict had engulfed the planet, larger than the first. Carathan's entry for this observation was the longest single document in the entire 74,000-year file. Portions of it were technical: weapons yields, logistical analyses, casualty projections, demographic impact assessments. But other portions were not technical at all. Carathan documented the systematic, industrialized extermination of a subset of the species by another subset of the species. Not in the context of warfare, not as a byproduct of conflict, as a project. An organized, bureaucratically administered program of deliberate annihilation conducted with the same industrial efficiency that the species applied to manufacturing and agriculture. The infrastructure for killing had been designed, constructed, optimized, and operated by individuals who documented their own work in detailed records. I set the file down when I reached this section. I closed my console. I sat in the dim warmth of the archives and breathed for a long time. I am Orenai. We process information. That is what we are for. But there are certain configurations of data that resist processing, not because they are complex, but because they are coherent. The data made sense. That was the problem. It was not random violence, not chaotic brutality of the sort that appears in the developmental records of many species. It was organized, intentional, documented by its own perpetrators. It had logic. And the logic was worse than madness, because madness can be categorized as aberration. This could not. I returned to the entry the following morning. Carathan's analysis of the second conflict continued for several hundred lines beyond the section that had stopped me. It included weapons data, infrastructure damage, agricultural disruption, population displacement. And then, near the end, Carathan reached the weapon. The species had harnessed atomic energy and used it to destroy 2 of its own cities. Carathan's description of the weapon was clinical. Yield estimates, blast radius calculations, radiation dispersal patterns, projected long-term environmental effects. The Sathari understood nuclear physics. They knew what the species had built. What Carathan could not process, and the entry made this clear in a way that no Sathari document I had ever read had made anything clear, was the decision, not the physics. The choice. A species that had existed for 74,000 years, that had survived a supervolcanic extinction event, that had built and rebuilt civilizations from its own ruins, that had developed philosophy and mathematics and law and art. That species had looked at the fundamental structure of matter and seen a weapon, and it had used that weapon on itself. This observer no longer considers the existing monitoring protocol adequate, Carathan wrote. Recommend immediate reclassification. Recommend restricted access to sector. Recommend formal quarantine assessment. This species has achieved the capability for self-extinction and has demonstrated the willingness to approach that threshold. The question is no longer whether they are a subject of scientific interest. The question is what they will become. I remember reading that line, "The question is what they will become," and feeling, for the first time, something I can only describe as vertigo. Not the physical kind, the kind where the scale of what you are looking at exceeds your ability to hold it all in view at once. The remaining entries were fewer. After Carathan's recommendation, the Directorate restricted access to the file and reduced the observation team to a single senior researcher with security clearance. The visits continued, but the tone had changed. The observers were no longer cataloging a curiosity. They were monitoring a threat. The species continued to develop nuclear weapons. It built larger ones. It built systems to deliver them across the full surface of the planet. Two major factions emerged, each possessing enough destructive capability to render the planet uninhabitable. And they maintained this arrangement, each holding the other's survival hostage for decades. The observer for this period, Melenthi of the Tessaran Conservatory, described it with a Sathari term that I had to look up. The closest translation is mutual annihilation equilibrium. The concept that peace could be maintained by the shared certainty of total destruction. The species has stabilized its largest conflict not through resolution, but through the credible promise of extinction, Melenthi wrote. This is not a strategy that any cataloged species has previously employed. Its long-term viability is uncertain. Its psychological implications for the species are undocumented. The species survived this period. The equilibrium held. The observer noted, with what I detected as reluctant acknowledgement, that the species used the intervening decades to advance its technology at an extraordinary rate. Space exploration, computing systems, medical breakthroughs, global communications networks. The same species that maintained enough nuclear weapons to sterilize its own planet also built machines that could think, mapped its own genetic structure, and sent members of its kind beyond the atmosphere of their world for the first time. And then came the final entry. The last observation in the file was written by Tanis of the Cardassian Institute, the same academic lineage as Veneth, the original survey leader who had documented the volcanic event 74,000 years earlier. I do not know if Tanis was aware of that symmetry. I suspect a Sathari would have been. Tanis arrived at the planet in what corresponded to the 24th century of the current era and found a civilization in crisis. The species had developed bioengineering, the capacity to manipulate the fundamental biological mechanisms of living organisms at the molecular level. This was not in itself remarkable. Many species reach this capability at some point in their technological development. What was remarkable was what had happened with it. An engineered pathogen had escaped containment. Tanis' analysis indicated it had originated in a research facility and spread through the planet's population within months, facilitated by the same global transportation networks that the species had built to connect its civilizations. The pathogen was sophisticated, not a natural mutation, but a designed organism, created for research purposes that Tanis could not determine from orbital observation alone. The effects were catastrophic. Tanis demographic models, based on population sampling and infrastructure analysis, estimated that approximately 75% of the planetary population had either died or been rendered reproductively non-viable. 3 out of every 4. The planet's cities were partially abandoned. Entire regions had gone dark. The global communications network, which the previous observer had noted as one of the species' most impressive achievements, was operating at a fraction of its former capacity. Tanis spent a long time at the planet, longer than any previous observer. The entry was meticulous. Population estimates, infrastructure damage assessments, agricultural disruption models, epidemiological analysis of the pathogen itself. But at the end, after all the data, Tanis wrote a passage that departed entirely from Sathari observational protocol. This observer has reviewed the complete file for this species, including all prior entries from the Cardassian Institute, the Vithane Conservatory, the Peline Conservatory, and the Tessarn Conservatory. The accumulated record spans approximately 74,000 years. In that time, the species has survived geological catastrophe, climatic extremes, pandemic disease, organized intraspecies warfare of increasing technological sophistication, and the development and deployment of nuclear weapons. It has now survived a self-inflicted biological catastrophe that has destroyed 3/4 of its population. This observer's recommendation is as follows. The quarantine classification proposed by Carathan of the Tessarn Conservatory should be implemented immediately and without a defined expiration. The species should not be contacted. The sector should be marked as restricted. All approach to the system should be prohibited. This recommendation is not made on the basis that the species is primitive, nor that it is dying. It is made on the basis that it is neither, and that this combination, given the full weight of the observational record, represents a category of risk for which the Directorate has no existing protocol. The quarantine should hold until we understand what we are dealing with. This observer does not believe we currently do. That was the final entry. After Tanis, no one went back. The quarantine was implemented. The beacons were deployed. The file was sealed. And then the Rashani crisis came, and the old civilization fell, and the Alliance rose in its place, and nobody remembered. I finished reading the file on a rest day. The archives were empty. Not that they were ever crowded, but on rest days, even the maintenance staff stayed away. I sat alone in the silence for a long time after I closed the last entry. 11 days, 74,000 years of observation, compressed into 11 days of reading. I had eaten when I remembered to. I had slept when my body demanded it. I had neglected my assigned cataloging work entirely. Torshan's next progress report would show nothing completed for nearly 2 weeks, which would be the first time in my career that I had failed to meet a deadline. I did not care. That surprised me. The Orenai take obligations seriously. Duty is not a word we use lightly. It is woven into our naming conventions, our social structures, our sense of self. To fail in an assigned task is not merely a professional lapse. It is an identity wound. And yet I sat in the archives on that rest day, knowing that my cataloging was unfinished and my progress report would show a gap, and I did not care. Something larger had overwritten the smaller obligation. The quarantine beacons were gone. The sector was unmonitored. The file had been sitting in the archives, unread, for the entire history of the Alliance. And the species that had survived everything its planet and its own nature could inflict upon it, had been left alone for 1,500 years. I did not know what that meant. I did not know what they had become in that time. I only knew what the Sathari had observed them to be before the quarantine. A species that rebuilt after every catastrophe, that accelerated after every collapse, that treated destruction as a catalyst rather than a conclusion. 1,500 years was a long time, long enough for the species to have destroyed itself as the nuclear era observers had feared. Long enough for it to have declined into irrelevance, or long enough for it to have become something that the Sathari, for all their thoroughness, had not been able to predict. I wrote my report that evening. It took me 2 days to compose. An Orenai report is a particular kind of document, factual, cited, structured to lead the reader through the evidence in the order most likely to produce accurate comprehension. We are trained in this from childhood. A well-constructed report does not argue, it does not persuade. It presents the data in a sequence that allows the conclusion to arrive in the reader's mind as though they had reached it independently. It is, I suppose, a form of manipulation, though we do not think of it that way. I structured my report in 3 sections. The first summarized the discovery, a pre-alliance survey file with an anomalous quarantine classification, assigned to a sector not currently listed as restricted. The second summarized the contents of the file, 74,000 years of observation, documenting a species of unusual resilience and developmental velocity, culminating in a formal quarantine recommendation. The third section, the shortest and the most difficult to write, outlined the discrepancy. The quarantine had been implemented. The beacons had been deployed. And at some point during or after the Rashani crisis, all of it had been lost. The beacons were gone. The records were unconverted. The sector was unlisted. The Alliance did not know the quarantine existed, and it did not know whether the species that had prompted it still did. I filed the report through standard channels, addressed to Lieutenant Commander Torshan as my immediate supervisor. I appended the file reference, the sector coordinates, and the observation timeline. I marked it as priority, which in Alliance Administrative Protocol means that the recipient is required to acknowledge it within 2 duty cycles. Torshan acknowledged it in 4 hours. He came to the archives in person, which he had never done outside his regular inspection schedule. He stood in the doorway of my workspace for a moment, looking at me with an expression I had not seen on a Rathani face before. I have since learned to recognize it, the look of someone who has just realized that a situation they are responsible for has exceeded their authority to manage. "You've read the complete file?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "All of it. All of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I forwarded your report to Commander Adesanya at Naval Intelligence. She will want to speak with you." He paused again. "Sub-Lieutenant, how long have you been working on this?" 13 days, sir. 11 reading, 2 composing the report. And the cataloging? Is behind schedule, sir. I will note it in my next progress report. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he shook his head, a Rathani gesture that conveys something between resignation and acknowledgement, and left. Commander Adesanya contacted me the following morning. She did not, as I had expected, ask me to submit a supplementary report or schedule a briefing at my convenience. She told me to present myself at the Naval Intelligence Directorate offices on Level 12 at the beginning of the next duty cycle. Level 12, the military levels. The levels I had never had reason to visit. I acknowledged the order, closed the communication, and sat very still at my console. Below me were the racks of unconverted Sathari data modules, stretching back into the dim recesses of the archive. Above me, 12 levels up, people whose names I did not know were reading a report written by an Orenai sub-lieutenant who had been assigned to the archives because no one considered the work important. The work had become important. I was not ready for what that meant. But I was Orenai. And when you are Orenai, readiness is not a prerequisite for duty. You go where the work takes you. The work was taking me to Level 12. Chapter 3, Level 12. I had been aboard Tanis Station for 5 months. In that time, I had learned the route from my quarters to the archives, from the archives to the mess hall, and from the mess hall back to my quarters. 3 corridors, 2 lift shafts, and a maintenance junction that saved 4 minutes over the standard route if you knew which hatch to use. That was my station, a triangle drawn in the lower core, through spaces that smelled of recycled air and old metal, where the lighting was adequate but never bright, and the only sounds were ventilation fans and the occasional distant vibration of the station's structural systems settling against their own mass. Level 12 was a different station. I noticed the change in the lift. The lower levels used cargo lifts, wide, slow, functional platforms with bare walls and floor grating that let you see the shaft mechanisms working beneath your feet. When I transferred to the main personnel lift at the junction on Level 6, the floor became solid. The walls were paneled. The lighting shifted from the flat white of the lower core to something warmer, more directional. The air changed, not just temperature. The Rathani military levels were kept cooler than the archives, but composition, cleaner. The metallic undertone that I had lived with for months was gone, replaced by something I could not identify. It was the absence of staleness. It was what air smelled like when the environmental systems were properly maintained and regularly inspected. I stepped out of the lift on Level 12 into a corridor that was wider than my entire workspace. The ceiling was high enough that a Rathani, and the Rathani are not a small species, could walk without any sense of confinement. The walls were a pale, neutral tone that I later learned was Standard Alliance military specification, chosen for its psychological properties: calming without being soporific, professional without being sterile. The floor was clean in a way that suggested it was cleaned frequently, not merely that it was new. There were people in the corridor. This should not have been remarkable, but I had spent 5 months in a section of the station where I might go an entire duty cycle without seeing another person. Here, officers moved with purpose, mostly Rathani, in the dark formal tunics of the naval service. But I saw 2 Tesseri communications specialists and an Orenai lieutenant I did not recognize, who glanced at me as we passed with the brief, neutral acknowledgement that Orenai give each other in unfamiliar institutional settings. I am here. You are here. We will not make this awkward. I found the Naval Intelligence Directorate offices at the end of the main corridor, behind a security checkpoint that required both my identification and a verbal confirmation code that Commander Adesane's office had transmitted to me that morning. The petty officer at the checkpoint, young Rathani, crisp uniform, processed my credentials with the particular care of someone who does not often see an Orenai sub-lieutenant requesting access to an intelligence facility. "Sub-Lieutenant Idrani?" he said, reading from his screen. "Assigned to the Naval Archives?" I confirmed. "The Orenai have it." I was still defining myself by the posting I had come from. He waved me through. Commander Adesane, from Torith Province, was not what I had expected. I am not certain what I had expected. The Rathani military officers I had interacted with, Torshan, and before him, the administrative staff who had processed my transfer, had been professional, competent, and fundamentally uninterested in the details of my work. They were line officers or support staff, people whose careers were built on operational duties, and the archives were a box they needed to check, not a subject they needed to understand. Adesan was naval intelligence, and the difference was immediately apparent. She was tall, even for a Rithani, and lean in a way that suggested either discipline or indifference to food. Her office was small, smaller than I had expected for a commander, and organized with a precision that I recognized because it mirrored my own. Everything had a place. Nothing was decorative. The only item on her desk that was not functional was a flat piece of polished stone, dark and smooth, the kind of object a person keeps because it is pleasant to hold while thinking. I noticed it because noticing things is what Orenai do, and because Addisane saw me notice it, and the fact that she registered my observation without reacting to it told me more about her than anything else in the room. "Sit," she said. The chair was Orenai's specification. It had been placed in her office before my arrival. That, too, told me something. "I've read your report," she said, "twice. I've also pulled the original file from the archives and had my staff verify the sector coordinates against current navigational data. The discrepancy is confirmed. The sector is unlisted, unmonitored, and there is no record of quarantine beacons ever having been deployed there, though your analysis of the file suggests they were. The file's internal references are consistent with beacon deployment," I said. "The quarantine classification includes a sub-tag that appears to reference an active monitoring infrastructure. I believe the beacons were deployed by the Sathari Directorate and were either decommissioned or lost during the Rashani crisis." "Lost," she said, "not a question." "Lost, sir, along with the institutional knowledge of their purpose." She was quiet for a moment. The Rathani do silence differently than the Orenai. When an Orenai is silent, we are processing. When a Rathani is silent, they are deciding. I had learned to tell the difference. "The species described in the observation logs," she said. "The quarantine was placed approximately 2,000 years ago, standard. The monitoring lapsed approximately 1,500 years ago. In your professional assessment, as the only person who has read the complete file, what is the range of possible outcomes?" It was precisely the right question. Not what did the file say, not what do you think happened. What is the range? She wanted the full spread, not a prediction. 3 primary scenarios, I said. First, the species destroyed itself. Their technological trajectory at the time of the final observation included nuclear weapons, bioengineering, and the demonstrated willingness to use both. Self-extinction is consistent with the data. Second, the species declined. The biological catastrophe, documented in the final entry, reduced their population by approximately 75%. It is possible they never recovered, that the event triggered a civilizational collapse from which they did not emerge. The species would still exist, but at a pre-industrial or subsistence level, confined to their planet and posing no strategic concern. I paused. "And the third scenario," Addisane said. "The third scenario is that the species recovered. As it has recovered from every previous catastrophe in its documented history, each time rebuilding to a level of technological and organizational complexity that exceeded what came before." Addisane looked at me steadily. "And if they've had 1,500 years to do it, then we do not know what they are now, sir. The observational record provides no basis for projection over that interval. But the pattern," I hesitated, because what I was about to say was not data, it was inference, and the Orenai are trained to distinguish carefully between the two. "Say it, Sub-Lieutenant." "The pattern suggests that 1,500 years of unobserved development following a near-extinction event would be consistent with significant advancement, possibly beyond anything the Sathari observers anticipated. She nodded, a single, controlled motion. Then she picked up the piece of polished stone from her desk, held it for a moment, and set it down again. "I am escalating your report to Rear Admiral Sereth," she said. "He will likely escalate it further. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that you will be asked to present your findings to individuals considerably above your rank and mine." "I understand, sir. I don't think you do, but you will." She looked at something on her screen. "In the meantime, you are temporarily reassigned from the archives to the Naval Intelligence Directorate. You will be given quarters on this level and access to a secure workstation. I want you to prepare a full analytical summary of the observation file, not a copy of the Sithari records, but a structured assessment. Timeline, threat evaluation, recommended courses of action. Can you do that?" "I am an archivist, sir. Threat evaluation is not part of my training." "I know what you are, Sub-Lieutenant. I'm asking you to do it anyway. You are currently the only person in the Alliance who has read the complete file. That makes you the closest thing to an expert we have, regardless of your training." A pause. "I will assign an intelligence analyst to work with you on the threat assessment sections. The factual analysis and historical summary are yours." "Yes, sir." She stood. The meeting was over. As I reached the door, she said, "Sub-Lieutenant." I turned. "The report you filed, the structure, the presentation, it was well done. Torshan didn't know what to do with it, which is why it reached me as quickly as it did. But the report itself was exactly what it needed to be. I did not know how to respond to that. Compliments on professional work are common among the Orenai. It is how we express respect. From a Rifani intelligence officer, I had no framework for it. "Thank you, sir," I said, and left. The quarters they gave me on level 12 were larger than my quarters in the lower core. The environmental controls had been adjusted to Orenai preferences, cooler, with a slightly higher oxygen mix. The console was an intelligence-grade workstation, with processing capacity several orders of magnitude beyond the archival terminal I was accustomed to. The chair fit. I sat in those quarters on my first evening and tried to understand what was happening to me. Not emotionally, the Orenai do not frame internal experience that way. Structurally, my world, which had been small and ordered and entirely within my comprehension, the archives, the data modules, the routine, had expanded in the space of a few days into something I could not see the edges of. I was the same person I had been 2 weeks ago, doing the same kind of work, but the context had changed so completely that the work no longer meant what it had meant. I had been cataloging old records. Now I was preparing an intelligence assessment for the Admiralty. The analytical summary took me 4 days. I worked with the intelligence analyst Adesine had assigned, a lieutenant named Pathari, from Desane province, young and sharp and visibly uncomfortable working with an Orenai on a project that he clearly felt should have been handled entirely within the intelligence community. He was not rude. He was simply Rithani, and the Rithani believe that information of strategic significance belongs in Rithani hands. That an Orenai archivist had found it first was an institutional irregularity that his training had not prepared him for. We worked well together despite this. I handled the historical analysis, the timeline, the observation summary, the pattern identification. Pathari handled the threat assessment sections, translating my factual account into the language and format that military decision-makers expected. He was good at it. I watched him take the data I had compiled and restructure it into matrices of probability and risk, and I understood for the first time how the same information could be true and yet mean different things depending on who arranged it. The Sathari had looked at this species and seen a subject of fascination. Pethari looked at the same data and saw a threat profile. Oath readings were accurate. That was the problem. On the 6th day after my arrival on Level 12, Commander Adesane informed me that Rear Admiral Sereth had reviewed the summary and was escalating it to the Admiralty Council. She said this in her office, standing in the tone of someone delivering information that she had known was coming and had already planned for. The Admiralty is likely to refer it to the Governing Council, she said. The quarantine was a pre-alliance action. Reinstating it, or deciding not to, is a political decision, not a military one. The Council will need to be briefed. By whom? I asked, though I already knew. By you, Sub-Lieutenant. You are the primary source. The Council will want to hear from the person who found the file, not from someone who read a summary of a summary. I felt something that I can only describe as the Orenai equivalent of dread. It is not the sharp, immediate sensation that other species describe. It is slower, a gradual awareness that the future contains something you are not equipped for, and that no amount of preparation will make you equipped for it, and that it is coming regardless. I have never addressed the Governing Council, sir. No one has, the first time they do it. She almost smiled. I think. The Rathani face is not easy for an Orenai to read, but there was something in the way the muscles around her eyes shifted, a fractional relaxation, gone as quickly as it appeared. I will be in the chamber. You will not be alone. What should I expect? She considered this. The council is composed of representatives from 11 species. 7 of them will be primarily concerned with the strategic implications. 2 will be concerned with the diplomatic implications. 1 will be concerned with the scientific implications. And 1, the Sathari delegate, will be concerned with something else entirely, though I am not certain what. And the High Chancellor? Adesane's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A door closing. The High Chancellor will be concerned with what the High Chancellor is always concerned with: control. You are presenting information, Sub-Lieutenant. The Chancellor will be calculating what to do with it before you finish your first sentence. That is not your problem. Your problem is accuracy. Present the data. Answer the questions. Do not speculate beyond what the file supports. And if I am asked for my opinion, you are Orenai. Your opinion is that the data should be examined further before conclusions are drawn. That is always your opinion. It has the advantage of being both true and safe. She paused. Sub-Lieutenant, I am going to tell you something that I would not normally tell a junior officer, because the situation is not normal. The council chamber is not a place where information is evaluated. It is a place where decisions are made. The people in that room have already decided what they believe about most things. What you are bringing them is new, genuinely, completely new. And that is dangerous because it forces them to form a position on something they have not had time to prepare a position on. Some of them will react to that discomfort by dismissing what you present. Others will react by overreacting. A very few will listen. How will I know which is which? You won't, not in the room. You will know afterward by what they do. She picked up the polished stone again, turned it once in her fingers, set it down. I have arranged for you to meet with the Admiralty's protocol officer tomorrow. She will walk you through the procedural requirements, where to stand, how to address the delegates, the order of precedence. Follow her instructions exactly. The protocol exists to keep you safe as much as to maintain decorum. Safe from what? From making a mistake that a council member can use against you. If you follow protocol perfectly, they can only engage with your data. If you deviate, they can engage with you. You do not want that. I understood. It was, in a way, not so different from the Orenai approach to reports. Structure your presentation so that the conclusion arrives in the listener's mind as though they reached it independently. The difference was that in an Orenai collegium, the goal was comprehension. In the council chamber, the goal was survival. I spent the next 3 days preparing. The protocol officer, a lieutenant commander named Vasith from Orenai province, whose entire career appeared to consist of ensuring that the correct things happened in the correct order in rooms where important people gathered, was thorough. She showed me diagrams of the council chamber. She explained the seating arrangement. The High Chancellor at the center of a curved dais. The species delegates arranged in order of membership seniority. The Undersecretary for Security seated at the Chancellor's immediate left. The presenter's position was a raised platform at the focus of the curve, positioned so that every delegate could see the speaker without turning. You will be visible to all of them simultaneously, Vasith said, in a tone that suggested this was a feature and not, as I experienced it, a source of profound discomfort. Maintain visual contact with the Chancellor when speaking. When answering a question from a specific delegate, you may direct your attention to that delegate, but return to the Chancellor before beginning your next point. Do not turn your back to any section of the dais. What if I need to reference my materials? Your materials will be projected on the display behind you. You will have a control interface at your station to advance through your presentation. Do not read from the display. The delegates can read. They are there to hear you. She drilled me for 2 hours on forms of address. The High Chancellor was addressed as Chancellor on first reference and Sir thereafter. Species delegates were addressed by their title and species designation on first reference, Delegate Jacquerith representing the Sathari, and by title alone thereafter. The Undersecretary for Security was addressed as Undersecretary, and never by name unless he spoke to me first. I memorized all of it. Memory is the one thing no Orenai struggles with. What I struggled with was the scale of what I was about to do. I was a sub-lieutenant, an archivist. I had been assigned to the lowest level of Tanis Station because my work was considered unimportant by everyone except the Orenai. And even among my own people, cataloging pre-alliance geological surveys was not a prestigious assignment. I had no connections, no political understanding, no experience with the kind of power that concentrated in rooms like the council chamber. I was the last person who should have been standing on that platform, but I was the only person who had read the file. On the evening before the briefing, I sat in my quarters on level 12 and reviewed my presentation one final time. It was structured the way Adesane had instructed: historical summary, observation timeline, quarantine analysis, current status assessment, and a single concluding page that outlined the discrepancy. Quarantine implemented, quarantine lost, sector unmonitored, species status unknown. I did not include a recommendation. Adesane had been clear about that. Present the data. The recommendation is theirs to make. If you presume to tell the governing council what to do, you give them permission to debate your judgment instead of the situation. Let the data speak. The data, I thought, spoke very clearly. The question was whether anyone in the chamber would hear what it was saying. I closed my workstation, dimmed the lights, and tried to sleep. The quarters were quiet. The air was the right temperature, the right composition. The chair fit, the bed fit. Everything on level 12 fit, because someone had made an effort to accommodate me. I was being taken care of in the efficient, impersonal way that the Alliance military takes care of assets it has decided are useful. I lay in the dark and thought about the Sathari observer Veneth, 74,000 years ago, documenting a volcanic eruption and noting, without particular concern, that a minor species on the planet below would probably not survive. I thought about Salachi, 64,000 years later, arriving to confirm the extinction and finding agriculture instead. I thought about Karathan, watching the species split the atom and writing in language that broke every Sathari convention of objectivity. The question is what they will become. And I thought about the 1,500 years of silence that followed the last entry. The beacons going dark, the records gathering dust, the alliance rising and never knowing. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of the most powerful individuals in the alliance and tell them that somewhere in an unmonitored sector of space, there might be an answer to Karathan's question. I did not sleep well. Chapter 4. The Chamber. The Governing Council chamber was located on the station's outer ring, in the diplomatic quarter, behind 3 security checkpoints and a corridor lined with the flags of every species that had signed the Alliance Charter. I counted them as I walked past. 11. 11 species, 11 governments, 11 sets of interests and fears and ambitions, all represented by individuals who sat in a curved room and made decisions that affected billions of lives across dozens of systems. And I was about to stand in front of them and tell them they had missed something. A Dessinée walked beside me. She had not spoken since we left the intelligence offices, and I had not asked her to. The Rasani do not engage in reassuring conversation before important events. They focus. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the measured rhythm of her stride, the way her eyes moved over the corridor with the automatic scanning habit of someone trained to notice things that did not belong. In this corridor, I did not belong. I suspect she was aware of that irony. The chamber itself was smaller than I had expected. The briefing materials Vasith had shown me, the diagrams, the seating arrangements, the procedural flows, had given me an impression of grandeur. The reality was more restrained. The room was circular, with a curved dais rising in shallow tiers on 3 sides. The delegate seats were arranged along the curve, each station equipped with a console and a privacy screen that could be raised during classified discussions. The ceiling was high, but not ostentatiously so. The lighting was even, sourceless, designed to eliminate shadows. There were no windows. The outer ring of Tanis Station looked out on stars, but the council chamber looked inward, as though the Alliance's leadership preferred not to be reminded of the scale of what they governed. The presenter's platform was exactly where Vasith had said it would be. A low circular stage at the focal point of the curve, raised perhaps a hand's width above the chamber floor. Not elevated enough to suggest authority, just enough to ensure visibility. I stepped onto it and felt the subtle wrongness of being looked at from all directions simultaneously. The delegates were already seated. I had been told not to arrive early, not to arrive late, and not to look around the room before beginning. Vasith's instructions had been explicit. Step onto the platform, face the Chancellor, wait for acknowledgement, then begin. Do not scan the faces. Do not try to read the room. The room will read you. I faced the Chancellor. High Chancellor Draven from the Korathi Sovereignty, the political entity that had produced most of the Alliance's senior leadership since the Rashani crisis, occupied the center of the dais. I had seen images of the Chancellor in official communications and news briefings. The images had not prepared me for the reality of being looked at by him. The Korathi are a Rifani subpolity, ethnically and biologically Rifani, but culturally distinct, more formal, more hierarchical, with a political tradition that valued strategic patience over the blunt directness that characterized most Rithani provinces. Draven embodied this. He was older than I had expected, with the particular stillness that comes not from calm, but from control. Every movement intentional, every silence chosen. He looked at me the way the Sathari observers had looked at the planet in their early entries, with clinical interest and without commitment. "Sub-Lieutenant Idrani," he said. His voice was quiet. The chamber's acoustics carried it perfectly. "Assigned to the Naval Intelligence Directorate. You may proceed." I noted that he identified me by my new posting, not my old one. Someone had briefed him. He already knew who I was and where I had come from, and he had chosen to introduce me as intelligence rather than archives. I did not know whether that was meant to elevate my credibility or to signal that the Intelligence Directorate was taking ownership of whatever I was about to present. I began. I will not reproduce my entire presentation. It covered the same ground I have already described in this account: the discovery, the observation timeline, the quarantine, the gap. I delivered it as Adesane had instructed. Data first, analysis second, no recommendation. The display behind me showed the timeline, the sector coordinates, the Sathari classification tags. I spoke clearly and did not rush. What I will describe is what happened in the room while I spoke, because the Council's reaction to the information was, in many ways, more significant than the information itself. The first delegate to respond was the Undersecretary for Security, Nasseri from Torath Province, seated at the Chancellor's immediate left. Nasseri was, I would learn this later, though I sensed it immediately, the most overtly military presence on the Council. Where Draven's authority expressed itself through stillness, Nasseri's expressed itself through focus. He leaned forward as I spoke, not to hear better, but to close distance, the way a predator narrows the space between itself and a point of interest. His questions, when they came, were sharp and sequential. The species developed nuclear weapons. What was their estimated yield at the time of the quarantine? The Sathari records indicate that by the late observation period, the species had developed weapons with yields sufficient to render their planet's surface uninhabitable if deployed in quantity, Undersecretary. And they deployed them. Twice, Undersecretary, against their own population centers. The quarantine was recommended after this deployment. And the biological weapon, the engineered pathogen, was that deliberate deployment as well? The Sathari assessment indicated an accidental release from a research facility, Undersecretary. Not a deliberate deployment. But the research itself was deliberate. Yes, Undersecretary. He sat back. Not satisfied, Nasseri did not give the impression of a person who was ever satisfied, but having established the points he wanted on the record. A species that built weapons of mass destruction, used them, and then built biological weapons. The fact that the pathogen was an accident was, to Nasseri, almost irrelevant. The capacity and the willingness were what mattered. The second delegate to engage was the representative of the Tesseri, a species I knew primarily as communications specialists. Technically inclined, politically cautious. Delegate Horath, from the Tesseri Concordat, asked a different kind of question. Sub-Lieutenant, you have stated that the quarantine beacons were lost during the Rishani crisis. Is it possible that the quarantine was deliberately terminated rather than accidentally lost? I considered this carefully. The file contains no record of a deliberate termination order, Delegate. The quarantine's administrative infrastructure appears to have been maintained by the Sathari Directorate for Exoplanetary Survey, which ceased to exist as an independent body when the Sathari polity was absorbed into the Alliance. The simplest explanation is that the quarantine's institutional support structure was destroyed along with the directorate during the crisis, and no successor institution assumed responsibility. So it was negligence. I did not answer immediately. Negligence implied fault, and I was not in a position to assign fault. It was an institutional failure. Delegate, whether it constitutes negligence, would require an assessment of whether any individual or body had explicit responsibility for maintaining pre-alliance quarantine protocols during the transition period. I am not aware of any such assignment. Horath made a small gesture, a tessary expression I did not recognize, and did not press further. I understood later that the question had not been about the quarantine at all. It had been about accountability. Horath was establishing for the record that the Alliance as an institution bore responsibility for the gap. That was a political position, not an analytical one, and it had been placed on the record through my testimony without me realizing it until afterward. Adesane had warned me about this. I had not understood the warning well enough. Unbiased. The delegate who surprised me was the Sathari representative. Delegate Jacareth Voon of the Tassarn Conservatory was the oldest person in the chamber. I do not mean this in the way it would be meant for most species. Older, more experienced, more tired. The Sathari do not age the way the Rithani do. They become more still. Jacareth sat in the Sathari delegation seat, historically the first seat on the dais, reflecting the Sathari's founding role in the Alliance, though the position no longer carried the authority it once had, and watched my presentation with an expression I could not read. When Jacareth spoke, the chamber changed. Not dramatically. The other delegates did not fall silent or turn to listen with visible deference. But there was a shift in attention, subtle and involuntary. The way a room adjusts when someone speaks who has earned the right to be heard through sheer duration of presence. Sub-Lieutenant Jacareth's voice was quiet, unhurried, and carried an accent that marked old Sathari linguistic patterns, even through the translation conventions. The observation log you have described was maintained by the Directorate for Exoplanetary Survey. I am familiar with the Directorate's protocols. The observers you have cited, Veneth, Selachi, Tessith, Carathan, Tesseni, were members of institutions I recognize. The Corassian Institute, the Vethane Conservatory, the Tassarn Conservatory. A pause. My own. I had not made this connection until Jacareth stated it. Tassarn, the Tassarn Conservatory, the lineage of Carathan, who had watched the species split the atom and written that the question was what they would become, and of Tessini, who had written the final entry and sealed the quarantine. Jacareth was of the same academic house, the same intellectual lineage, separated by millennia, but connected by the unbroken chain of Sathari scholarly tradition that defined who they were. You have read the complete file, Jacareth said, not a question. Yes, delegate. And in your assessment, not as an intelligence analyst, not as a military officer, but as an archivist who has spent time with Sathari records, what do you believe the observers themselves thought of this species? The question was not what Adesane had prepared me for. It was not about threat assessment or strategic implications or quarantine protocols. It was about the Sathari. It was about what it had been like, across 74,000 years, to watch. I believe they were fascinated, delegate, I said, and I believe they were afraid. And I believe that by the end of the observation period, they could no longer tell the difference. Jacareth looked at me for a long moment. Then Jacareth did something that I did not understand until much later, when I learned more about Sathari customs. A slow inclination of the head, held for precisely 3 seconds. It was, I was told afterward, a gesture of recognition, not agreement, not approval, but acknowledgement that the person being addressed had seen something accurately. The Chancellor watched this exchange without expression. I noticed because I was not supposed to be watching him. But an Orenai notices things. And what I noticed was that the Chancellor's attention during Jacquerette's question was not on Jacquerette or on me. It was on the other delegates. He was watching them watch us. The formal briefing lasted 40 minutes. I answered 11 questions from 6 delegates. 3 delegates asked nothing at all. The representatives of the Valesi Trading Compact, the Orenai Collegium Authority, and the Drathani Border Federation. Their silence meant different things. The Valesi were calculating commercial implications. The Orenai representative, and I felt a complicated pang seeing a senior member of my own species sitting on the dais, watching me with the patient, assessing gaze that I recognized from my own mirror, was processing. The Drathani, I learned later, had been instructed by their government to observe without committing to a position until the political implications became clearer. When the last question had been answered, the Chancellor thanked me in the formal mode and dismissed me from the chamber. The dismissal was procedural. My role as presenter was complete, and what followed was council deliberation, which I was not cleared to observe. Arisane met me outside the chamber door. She did not ask how it had gone. She had been in the room. Instead, she said, "You handled Nasri well. And Jacquerette's question, that was not something I anticipated. Your answer was honest. That was the right choice." I did not have time to choose, sir. It was simply what I believed. "Yes," she said, "that is why it was the right choice." She guided me to a waiting area, a small, featureless room off the main corridor, with 2 chairs and nothing else. "The council will deliberate. It could take hours or it could take days. Most of the real discussion will not happen in the chamber. Go back to your quarters. I will contact you when there is a decision." "What do you think they will decide?" She looked at me with the expression I was beginning to recognize as her version of patience. Not the natural kind, but the practiced kind. The patience of someone who has learned to tolerate questions from people who do not yet understand the machinery they are caught in. "They will send someone to look," she said. "The question is who and with what authority. That is what the deliberation will actually be about. The Chancellor already knows what he wants. Nasri already knows what he wants. They do not want the same thing, but they will negotiate a position that satisfies both, and it will be presented to the Council as a consensus recommendation, and the Council will ratify it, because objecting would require proposing an alternative, and no one will have had enough time to prepare one." I stared at her. "You're saying the decision is already made. I'm saying the decision will be made in conversations you and I are not part of. The council session is where it becomes official." She opened the door. "Get some rest, Sub-Lieutenant." The decision came in 2 days. Addison summoned me to her office on the morning of the 3rd day after the briefing. She was standing when I arrived, not behind her desk, but beside it, which I had learned meant she had something to say that was not routine. The polished stone was in her hand, not on the desk. She was turning it slowly between her fingers. "The Council has authorized an expedition to the quarantined sector," she said. "A single vessel. The stated mission is reconnaissance and assessment. Determine the current status of the species and the sector. Evaluate whether the quarantine should be reinstated, and report back to the Council with recommendations." "A single vessel," I repeated. "A light cruiser, the AIS Threshold, Captain Voren from Desane Province commanding." She paused, and something in the pause was heavier than the words on either side of it. The captain has been given broad operational authority, broader than is standard for a reconnaissance mission. I understood what she was not saying. Authority to act if the assessment warrants it. Authority to recommend quarantine reinstatement. Authority to recommend escalation to a full military response. And she set the stone down on her desk with a small, precise click. Provisional authority to take immediate defensive action if the expedition encounters a direct threat. Defensive action. The phrase was Standard Alliance military terminology, and like most standard terminology, its precision was a form of camouflage. Defensive action could mean retreat. It could mean signaling for reinforcements. It could also mean firing on a target that the captain determined posed an imminent threat to the expedition, which could mean anything from a hostile vessel to a civilization that the captain judged too dangerous to leave uncontained. The Chancellor's compromise, I said, understanding now. The Chancellor wanted a larger force. Nasseri wanted a fleet. What they agreed on was a single ship with a captain they trust, carrying authority that makes the fleet unnecessary unless the captain decides otherwise. It is elegant in its way. She did not say whether she thought it was right. The council ratified it unanimously. Even the Sathari delegate voted in favor, though Jakareth attached a written statement to the record that I have not been authorized to share with you. I filed that away. Jakareth had voted yes and filed a statement. That meant the Sathari representative had wanted their position preserved regardless of the outcome. A hedge or a conscience or both. Why are you telling me this, sir? I asked, though I already knew. The weight of the conversation had been pulling towards something since I walked in, and I could feel the shape of it now, approaching. Adessen sat down. A gesture was deliberate. She was shifting from delivering information to having a conversation, and she wanted me to recognize the transition. The expedition requires a record specialist, someone with comprehensive knowledge of the Sathari observation file and the ability to provide historical context to the commanding officer in real time. There is exactly one person in the Alliance who meets that requirement. Sir, before you respond, and I want you to understand that this is not a request you are required to accept. There are things you need to know. She folded her hands on the desk. Captain Voren is Rithani, career military with a service record that the Admiralty considers exemplary. He is not a scientist. He is not an explorer. He is a line officer who has been given an intelligence mission because the people who selected him believe he will make the decision they want made, whatever the data shows. I do not know if that assessment is correct. I do know that you will be the only non-Rithani officer on the ship's senior staff and the only Orenai aboard. She let that settle. You will also be the only person aboard who has read the full observation file. That gives you a form of authority that does not appear on any organizational chart. The authority of knowing something that no one else in the room knows as well as you do. It is not the kind of authority the Rithani are accustomed to respecting. You will need to earn it, and you will need to earn it every day. I understand, sir. I don't think you do. But I've said that to you before, and you have consistently proven me wrong, which is why I am recommending you for this assignment rather than simply filling the billet with the most convenient analyst available. She opened a file on her console. There is one more thing. If you accept this assignment, your transfer to the Naval Intelligence Directorate will be formalized, and you will be promoted to lieutenant effective immediately. This is not a reward. It is a practical necessity. A sub-lieutenant does not have the clearance level required for the intelligence products that will be generated during this mission, and a sub-lieutenant cannot address a captain as a peer in operational briefings. You will still be junior to every other officer in the senior staff. But you will be close enough in rank that they cannot dismiss you on procedural grounds. I sat very still. An Orenai processes, an Orenai orients. Lieutenant Idrani, assigned to the Naval Intelligence Directorate. It was a different name. In the Orenai way of things, it was a different person. The archivist who had catalogued geological surveys in the lower core of Tanis Station was, in the formal sense that mattered to my people, gone. Replaced by someone who wore the insignia of an intelligence officer and had been assigned to a military vessel bound for a sector of space that the Alliance had forgotten, and that might contain a species capable of things no one in the Alliance had ever encountered. "I accept, sir," I said. Adasan nodded. Not warmly. She was not a warm person, but with something that I had learned to read as respect. "The threshold departs in 9 days. Use the time to prepare. I will have a full intelligence briefing package assembled for you. Everything we have on the sector, the surrounding systems, and the operational parameters of the mission. Review it before you board." "Yes, sir." "And, Lieutenant." She used the new rank without hesitation, as though it had always been mine. "Commander Adasan will remain your reporting authority within the Intelligence Directorate for the duration of the mission. If you encounter a situation where the captain's orders and your professional judgment are in conflict, you will follow the captain's orders and log your objection through secure channels to my office. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "That channel exists for your protection. Use it if you need to. I will be monitoring." She picked up the stone again, held it for a moment, and placed it in a drawer. "Dismissed, Lieutenant." I stood, saluted in the Alliance fashion, a gesture I had learned but rarely had occasion to use, and left her office. 9 days. I spent them in the Intelligence Directorate's secure workspaces, reading everything Adasane's staff provided. The operational parameters of the mission, the thresholds specifications. A Vashani-class light cruiser, crew complement of 84, equipped for extended independent operations. The ship's senior staff roster, Captain Voren, Executive Officer Commander Hathane from Kelvani Province, Science Officer Lieutenant Commander Renathi from Orenai Province, Tactical Officer Lieutenant Commander Soren from Toreth Province, Navigator Lieutenant Tesserae from Desane Province, and a Marine detachment of 12, under the command of a lieutenant whose name I do not recall reading, but who would become, in time, one of the people I most dreaded seeing in the corridors of the ship. I studied the roster with the thoroughness my training demanded. Predominantly Rithani. The science officer's provincial origin, Orenai, was notable. Orenai Province had historically been the most academically oriented of the Rithani territories, producing a disproportionate number of the species' scientists and engineers. Lieutenant Commander Renathi might be an ally, or at least a mind that operated on frequencies closer to my own. The tactical officer, Saran, came from Toreth Province, the same province as the Undersecretary for Security, Niseri. That could mean nothing. In an institution as large as the Alliance military, provincial origin was not destiny. But I noted it. I also noted the absence. There was no Sathari on the crew. No Orenai other than myself. No representative of any species that might bring a perspective different from the one the Rithani military culture would naturally produce. I was the exception, and exceptions are not the same as counterweights. On the 8th day, I packed my belongings. This did not take long. The Orenai do not accumulate. My quarters on level 12 had been temporary, and I had treated them as such, a workspace with a bed attached. Everything I owned fit in a single standard-issue kit bag. uniforms, personal data storage, a reference archive of Sathari encoding protocols that I had compiled during my time in the lower core, and a small object that I had kept since my years at the Collegium on Varath. It was a fragment of inscribed stone, a piece of the Sathari data tablet, broken and unreadable, that my instructor at the Collegium had given me when I completed my training. A reminder, she had said, that even lost information leaves traces. The archivist's duty is to find them. I held it for a moment before placing it in my bag, and I sealed the bag, powered down my workstation, and left Level 12 for the last time. The threshold was berthed at Docking Bay 7, in the military section of the station's outer ring. I walked there through corridors I had never used, past offices and operations centers and briefing rooms that belonged to a world I had only recently entered and did not yet understand. Rithani officers passed me without notice. I was wearing the Intelligence Directorate's insignia now and the rank tabs of a lieutenant, and to anyone who glanced at me, I was simply another junior officer moving through the station on orders. No one knew I was carrying 74,000 years of silence in my kit bag. I reached the docking bay and stopped. Through the observation gallery's viewport, I could see the threshold, a sleek, angular hull painted in the dark gray of Alliance naval vessels, smaller than I had imagined, but carrying itself with the compact density of a ship designed to operate far from support. It was not beautiful, not in the way the Orenai understand beauty, but it was purposeful. Every line served a function. Every surface had been designed by people who expected the ship to go somewhere dangerous and come back. Whether it would come back from where it was going, I did not know. I adjusted the strap of my kit bag, straightened my uniform, and walked through the docking umbilical to board the ship that would carry me to the answer to Carathan's question. Chapter 5. The Threshold. A ship is a small world. I understood this theoretically before I boarded the threshold, in the way that an archivist understands most things, through records, through the accounts of others, through data organized and cataloged and stored in formats that preserve information while stripping it of the texture that makes information feel real. I had read crew reports from long-duration voyages. I had processed logistical summaries and personnel assessments and after-action reviews that described in precise military language the dynamics of 84 people sealed in a metal hull for weeks at a time. None of it had prepared me for the smell. Every ship has a smell. The Thresholds was a combination of the Rithani standard environmental mix, slightly warmer and drier than I preferred, with that faint mineral undertone that Rithani biology produces and Rithani noses filter out, overlaid with machine oil, recycled air that had passed through scrubbers a few too many times, and the particular institutional scent of a military vessel that has been cleaned often and thoroughly, without ever quite being clean. It was not unpleasant. It was simply present constantly, the way the hum of the ship's reactor was present, a background condition that you stopped noticing consciously, but that your body never fully adjusted to. I was assigned quarters on the officer's deck, in a cabin that was smaller than my workspace in the archives had been. A berth, a console, a storage locker, a fold-down desk that served as dining surface and workstation both. The environmental controls had been set to Rithani standard, and I spent my first 20 minutes aboard submitting the request to adjust them. The request was approved in 3 hours, faster than anything had ever been approved in the lower core. The Intelligence Directorate's insignia on my file, I suspected, carried a weight that my name alone did not. The Threshold departed Tanis Station at the beginning of the second watch on my first full day aboard. I felt the departure as a series of vibrations, the docking clamps releasing, the maneuvering thrusters firing in short, precise bursts, and then the deeper, steadier pulse of the main drive engaging. There was no ceremony, no announcement from the captain. The ship simply began to move, and the station fell away behind us, and the stars shifted as the navigator, Lieutenant Idrani, brought us onto our outbound heading. The transit to the quarantine sector would take, by the navigator's estimate, 23 days at standard cruise. 23 days of travel, followed by an unknown duration on station in a sector that no Alliance vessel had visited in 1,500 years. The mission parameters were open-ended. We would stay as long as the captain deemed necessary to complete the assessment. There was no scheduled return date. I did not find this reassuring. I met Captain Voren on my second day. He did not seek me out. I was summoned to his ready room, a small compartment adjacent to the bridge, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall-mounted display showing the ship's current position relative to Tanis Station. The door was open when I arrived. He was reading something on his console, and he did not look up immediately. This was, I would learn, characteristic. The captain did not perform attentiveness. He finished what he was doing, and then he gave you his attention. And when he did, it was complete. "Lieutenant Idrani," he said, looking up. "Sit." I sat. He studied me for a moment. The Rithani face is not subtle. Their expressions are broader than the Orenai's, more readable, though I had learned that readability could be its own form of camouflage. What I saw in Voren's face was assessment. He was cataloging me the way I had cataloged data modules, quickly, efficiently, placing me in a category so that he could stop thinking about where I fit and start thinking about how to use me. "I've read your report," he said, "and the analytical summary you prepared with the Intelligence Directorate. Thorough work. I understand you are the only person who has read the complete Sithari observation file." "Yes, Captain." "Then you are the most informed person aboard this vessel regarding the species we are going to assess. That makes you valuable to me, Lieutenant. I want to be clear about what that means." He leaned back. The chair was too large for him to do this comfortably, which surprised me. It was his own ready room, and I wondered if the Rithani deliberately chose furniture that demanded upright posture, or if this particular captain simply didn't care about comfort. "I will be relying on you to brief my senior staff during the transit. I want them to understand what we are potentially dealing with before we arrive, the full history, the observation record, the pattern of behavior. You will schedule these briefings through the executive officer, Commander Hathen. 1 per day, beginning tomorrow, continuing until you have covered the complete file or we arrive, whichever comes first." "Understood, Captain. I will attend all briefings." He paused. "I will also want private access to the unabridged observation logs on my personal console. Please coordinate with the communications officer to transfer the files under appropriate security protocols." He wanted to read ahead. I noted this without comment. "Yes, Captain. One more thing." He looked at me directly, not the scanning assessment of a moment ago, but something more focused. "You are the only Orenai on this ship. You are also the most junior officer on my senior staff. I am aware that this will be uncomfortable for you. I expect you to perform your duties regardless of comfort. If you encounter difficulties with the crew, bring them to Commander Hathen. Do not bring them to me. I have a ship to run and a mission to execute, and personnel management is the XO's responsibility. Clear?" "Clear, Captain." "Good. Dismissed." I left the ready room with 2 impressions. The first was that Captain Voren was exactly what Adesane had described: a line officer, decisive, efficient, not interested in nuance or ambiguity. He would process the data I gave him and reach a conclusion, and the conclusion would be clean and actionable, because that was how his mind worked. The second impression was harder to articulate. It was something in the way he had said valuable to me. The possessive construction, the transactional framing. I was a resource. He would use me for what I was good at. And when my usefulness was exhausted, or the mission no longer required my particular expertise, I would cease to be a factor in his calculations. This was not cruelty. It was not even disrespect. It was simply how the Rithani military mind categorized the world. Mission, resources, obstacles. Everything and everyone fell into one of those three categories. I wondered which category the species at the end of our voyage would fall into. I suspected the captain had already decided. The briefings began the following day. Commander Hathian, the XO, assigned me the senior staff briefing room, a compartment on the command deck that seated 8 and had a display wall capable of rendering the Sathari observation data in full-dimensional projection. Hathian was efficient and impersonal in the way that executive officers are trained to be. He was the mechanism that translated the captain's wishes into operational reality, and he did it without adding his own preferences to the process. He assigned me a time slot, confirmed the attendee list, and left. The attendees were the ship's senior officers: Captain Voron, Commander Hathain, Science Officer Lieutenant Commander Ranathi, Tactical Officer Lieutenant Commander Soren, Navigator Lieutenant Tesserae, and Marine Detachment Commander Lieutenant Kethis. 6 Rithani and 1 Orenai, seated around a table, looking at 74,000 years of history. I structured the briefings chronologically as I had experienced the file, not because this was the most analytically efficient approach, but because it was the most honest. The Sathari observers had watched this species develop over millennia, and the story of that observation had its own arc, its own momentum, its own escalating pattern of surprise and reassessment. To present it out of order, organized by threat category or capability assessment, would have been to impose a framework on data that resisted frameworks. The captain wanted his officers to understand what they were dealing with. The best way to achieve that was to let them experience the same dawning realization that the Sathari had experienced, and that I had experienced, reading the file in the archives. The first briefing covered Toba and the agricultural revolution. I presented the data cleanly: the volcanic event, the projected extinction, the 64,000-year gap, and the Sathari's discovery that the species had not only survived, but reorganized its entire relationship with its planet. I showed them Veneth's dismissal and Salachi's shock. The room's reaction was muted. A species surviving a volcanic event was unusual, but not unprecedented. Agriculture was a recognized developmental stage. The Rithani officers listened, asked a few technical questions, and moved on. Lieutenant Commander Soren, the tactical officer, made no notes. Lieutenant Tesserae, the navigator, made several, which I noticed because I noticed things. The second briefing covered the Bronze Age through classical antiquity, multiple independent civilizations, accelerated development, the simultaneous rise of philosophy and organized warfare. I showed them Tesseth's observation about the development rate falling outside projected parameters, and Tessera's analysis of the species' parallel capacity for moral reasoning and violence. This briefing produced a longer silence when it ended. Commander Hathain asked a question about the species' technological base. Ranathi, the science officer, asked about the Sathari's methodology for assessing cognitive development. Soren asked how large the armies were. The captain said nothing. He was reading something on his personal console, that was not part of the briefing materials I had prepared. The unabridged logs, I assumed. He was already ahead of me. The third, fourth, and fifth briefings covered the medieval period through early industrialization. I watched the crew's engagement deepen as the briefings progressed. The species was becoming real to them, not an abstract entry in an ancient file, but a pattern they could see developing, a trajectory they could follow. A science officer began asking questions that went beyond methodology into genuine curiosity. The navigator started bringing additional reference materials to the sessions: comparative development rates for other known species, stellar cartographic data for the quarantine sector, transit time calculations. The tactical officer also became more engaged, but differently. Soren's questions sharpened. He wanted numbers, population estimates, resource extraction rates, military organization details. How were the armies structured? What were the command hierarchies? How quickly could they mobilize? The Sathari records did not always contain the specific data Soren wanted, and when I told him this, he would nod, make a notation, and ask the next question. He was building something in his notes, an assessment document, parallel to the briefings, that I was not invited to see. I mentioned this to no one, but I recorded it in my private log through the secure channel Adesane had established. Sixth, briefing was the World Wars. I had thought about how to present this material for a long time. In the archives, reading Carathan's entries alone, I had been overwhelmed. I did not want to overwhelm the senior staff. Overwhelmed people stop processing and start reacting, and I needed them to process. So I was methodical. I presented the First World War as a case study in industrialized conflict. The technologies, the scale, the casualty figures, the aftermath. I showed them Carathan's analysis of chemical weapons deployment and mechanized warfare. I let the numbers speak. Then I presented the interwar period, the peace mechanism, the attempt at international governance, the species' first organized effort to prevent its own destruction. Then I showed them that it had failed and what happened next. The room was different after the second conflict. Not silent. The Reconnaissance do not process difficult information through silence the way the Orenai do. There was a low murmur, the sound Reconnaissance make when they are absorbing something that challenges their existing models. Soren had stopped taking notes. Hathane had leaned back in his chair with his arms folded, a defensive posture I had not seen from him before. Renathi was staring at the display, where I had left Carathan's words visible. The question is no longer whether they are a subject of scientific interest. The question is what they will become. The captain broke the silence. It was the first time he had spoken during a briefing. The nuclear weapons, he said. What was the delivery capability at the time of this observation? The Sathari records indicate that by the late observation period, several decades after the initial deployment, the species had developed delivery systems capable of reaching any point on their planet's surface within minutes. Captain. 2 major factions each maintained arsenals sufficient for complete planetary sterilization. And they did not use them. They did not, Captain. The Sathari observer described the resulting strategic equilibrium as... I checked my notes. Mutual annihilation equilibrium. Both factions maintained the capability to destroy the other, and therefore neither acted. The captain looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned to Soren. The exchange between them was brief. A glance, a fractional nod from the tactical officer, and a return of the captain's attention to me. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. If I had not been watching, if I had been anyone other than an Orenai, I would have missed it. But I was Orenai, and I did not miss it. And what I saw in that 2-second exchange was recognition, not of the species' nuclear capability, though that was part of it. Recognition of a strategic concept. The Orenai military understood deterrence. They practiced it themselves, in their own way, in their relationships with the other alliance species. But they had never encountered a species that had invented it independently, from first principles, and deployed it against itself before it had ever met another civilization. The captain did not ask any more questions. The briefing ended. The officers filed out. I remained at the display, powering down the projection system, and I noticed that the captain paused at the door. He did not say anything. He looked at the display, now dark, and then at me, and then he left. It was the kind of look that Addison's polished stone would have been useful for. The look of someone whose hands needed something to do while their mind worked. The 7th briefing covered the Cold War, the space age, and the bioengineering catastrophe. I presented to Tanis' final entry, the quarantine recommendation, the sealed file, the end of 74,000 years of observation. When I finished, the room was quiet in a way it had not been before. The previous briefings had ended with questions, discussion, the productive noise of professionals processing new information. This briefing ended with something else. I did not have a word for it at the time. I have since learned one, borrowed from the Idrani military vocabulary. The silence of assessment complete. The moment when all the data has been received, and the mind begins the work of deciding what it means. Soren spoke first. The quarantine was placed approximately 2,000 standard years ago. It has been unmonitored for 1,500. At the time of the final observation, the species had nuclear weapons, rudimentary space travel, global communications, and had recently suffered a biological catastrophe that reduced its population by 75%. He looked at his notes. If we assume even a modest recovery and development trajectory, we cannot assume anything, the captain said. It was the sharpest I had heard him speak. Assumptions are what we go to dispense with. We observe, we assess, we report. The briefings are complete. From this point forward, we operate on data we collect ourselves. He looked around the table. All crew to heightened readiness, effective immediately. We enter the quarantine sector in 6 days. When we arrive, we go to silent running, passive sensors only, no active emissions. We watch before we are seen. Is that understood? A chorus of acknowledgments. The briefing dissolved. Officers moved toward the door. Lieutenant Idrani, the captain said, remained. I remained. The room emptied. The captain stayed seated, his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. The display on the wall showed the ship's current position, a small icon moving through empty space toward a destination that the map showed as a featureless void. The Safari who wrote the final entry, he said. Tessani, from the same academic house as the first observer. The Cardassian Institute, Captain. Yes. 74,000 years of observation, and the last person to look was from the same lineage as the first. There's a symmetry to that. He paused. The Safari were thorough. I'll grant them that. But they were scientists, and scientists observe. They watched this species for 74,000 years, and their final conclusion was that they didn't understand what they were looking at. He looked at me. I am not a scientist, Lieutenant. I am a naval officer. I do not have the luxury of not understanding. I will arrive at that system. I will assess what I find, and I will reach a conclusion. That is what I was sent to do. Yes, Captain. Your briefings were useful. My officers are better prepared than they would have been without them. That is your contribution, and I acknowledge it. He stood. When we arrive, I will need you on the bridge for real-time analysis. If we encounter anything that connects to the historical record, behavioral patterns, technology that matches Sathari descriptions, anything, I want to know immediately. Can I rely on you for that? You can, Captain. Good. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, as he had after the previous briefing, and said something that I have thought about many times since. The safari asked what this species would become. That was the wrong question. The right question is what they are now. What they became is already decided. We just don't know the answer yet. He left. I sat alone in the briefing room and listened to the ship around me, the reactor hum, the ventilation, the faint creak of the hull against the void. 6 days to arrival. 6 days to the edge of a sector that had been silent for 1,500 years. I opened my secure channel to Odasane's office and filed my report for the day. I included the captain's words as precisely as I could remember them. I noted the exchange between the captain and Soren. I noted the tactical officer's parallel assessment document. I noted the captain's decision to go to silent running before entering the sector. Then I added a line that I had not planned to write, and that I almost deleted before sending. The captain has already decided what he will find. He is not going to observe. He is going to confirm. I sent the report, I powered down the console, and I went to my quarters to wait for whatever was waiting for us in the silence. Chapter 6: What the Silence Built. We entered the quarantine sector on the 24th day of the voyage, 17 hours behind the navigator's original estimate. Lieutenant Idrani had adjusted our approach twice during the final leg, dropping from standard cruise to reduce our drive signature, then altering our entry vector to bring us in along the system's ecliptic plane, where the background radiation from the star would help mask our presence. It was good work. Careful, precise, the kind of navigation that does not draw attention to itself, because drawing attention was precisely what it was designed to prevent. Captain Voren ordered silent running as we crossed the sector boundary. The ship went quiet in a way I had not experienced before. Active sensors shut down. Communications arrays retracted. The main drive dropped to minimum output, just enough to maintain heading, and the reactor's thermal signature was routed through the ship's heat sinks rather than radiated into space. The threshold became, as much as a crewed vessel could, invisible. I was on the bridge, as the captain had requested. My station was a secondary console at the rear of the command deck, not a primary duty station, but a monitoring position, equipped with access to the ship's sensor feeds and my own analytical software. From there, I could see the main view screen, the navigation plot, and the backs of every officer's head. I could also see the captain standing at his position near the center of the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the darkness ahead with the absolute stillness of a man who had spent his career waiting for things to resolve into clarity. A system emerged on our long-range passive sensors in stages. The star first, a main sequence yellow dwarf, precisely matching Basathari records. Then the orbital bodies, resolving one by one as our instruments gathered light that had left those objects minutes or hours ago. Gas giants in the outer system, rocky inner worlds, and the third planet from the star, sitting in the habitable zone, blue and white and unmistakably alive. Confirmed match to Sathari survey coordinates, Pesare said quietly. On silent running, the bridge crew spoke in low voices as though the void could hear them. Third planet, habitable margin world. Atmospheric composition consistent with active biosphere. Any artificial emissions? Voren asked. There was a pause. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In that pause, the entire bridge seemed to hold its breath. "Yes, Captain," Tesserae said. "Broad-spectrum electromagnetic emissions across multiple frequency bands. Modulated signals consistent with communications traffic. Significant volume." Another pause. "Captain, the emission density is considerable. I am also detecting energy signatures in orbit around the third planet. Multiple sources. Moving." The bridge went very still. "Ships," Voren said. "Not a question. Ships, Captain, I count." Tesserae worked his console. "At current resolution, at least 40 discrete signatures in the immediate orbital space of the third planet. There appear to be additional signatures at greater distances, interorbital traffic between the third and fourth planets, and what may be activity near several of the outer moons. 40 ships, in a system that the Alliance's charts listed as empty." I watched the captain's face. It did not change. Whatever he was feeling, surprise, alarm, vindication, he kept it behind the mask that Rithani command officers wore like a second skin. He turned to Soren. "Tactical assessment." "Too early, Captain. We need better resolution. Passive sensors at this range can give us count and approximate tonnage, but not configuration or capability." Soren was leaning over his console, hands moving across the interface with the focused intensity of someone whose entire professional existence had been preparing for this moment. "Recommend we close to median-range passive scan distance. We should be able to resolve individual vessel profiles without being detected, assuming their sensor technology is within projected parameters." "Assuming," the captain repeated. "Yes, Captain. We have no data on their current sensor capability. The Sathari records predate any technology that would be relevant." Voren looked at the view screen. The small, bright dot of the star, the invisible worlds orbiting it, the invisible ships orbiting those worlds. Then he made the decision that military officers are paid to make. "Helm, take us in. Minimum signature approach. Close to medium passive range and hold position. All departments maintain silent running. No active emissions of any kind." The threshold slid forward into the darkness toward the system that should have been dead. "It took us 2 days to close to medium passive scan range. 2 days of crawling through the outer system on minimal power. Sensors drinking in everything the universe offered without asking for more. 2 days during which the picture on our screens grew steadily more detailed and steadily more impossible. The planet was not merely inhabited. It was the center of an active technological civilization with an industrial capacity that our instruments could measure from light hours away. Atmospheric spectroscopy showed a composition consistent with advanced manufacturing. Trace elements in the upper atmosphere that indicated large-scale industrial chemistry, energy generation, materials processing. The electromagnetic spectrum was saturated with communications traffic in formats our systems could not decode. The orbital infrastructure was extensive. Stations, platforms, and what appeared to be construction facilities in various orbits around the planet and its single large moon. And the ships, more of them now, as our sensors resolved fainter signatures. Not 40, closer to 200, ranging from small vessels that might be personal transports to large structures that read as either heavy freighters or, and Soren said this with the careful neutrality of a man handling something volatile, military platforms. "I need closer scans of the larger vessels," Soren said during the morning briefing on our second day of approach. "At this range, I can give you tonnage estimates and power output, but I cannot resolve internal configuration. Their hull materials are..." He paused, frowning at his console. Unusual. The passive returns are attenuated. I am getting good readings on power output, drive emissions, and gross dimensions, but fine detail of internal systems is degraded. Degraded how? Voren asked. The hull composition is partially opaque to our scanning frequencies, Captain. I can see through it in some bands, but not others. It is not jamming. There is no active countermeasure signature. The material itself has properties that interfere with passive sensor penetration. I have never encountered this in any Alliance vessel or any vessel in our threat database. Renathi, the science officer, leaned forward. Advanced materials science. If they have developed hull composites that are inherently resistant to broad-spectrum scanning, that suggests a level of materials engineering that is significant. Or it suggests they build their ships out of whatever is locally available, and it happens to be dense, Soren replied. We should not overinterpret incomplete data. Agreed, the captain said. Continue approach. Get me better scans. At medium passive range, close enough to resolve individual vessels in detail, far enough that our minimal energy signature should remain below detection threshold. The threshold settled into a monitoring position in the shadow of a large outer system body, an unremarkable rock that served as both shield and anchor. From here, our sensors could study the inner system with considerably more precision. The results were frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. Soren compiled his first detailed assessment of the larger vessels on our third day in system. He presented it to the senior staff with the clipped professionalism I had come to expect from him. But I detected, beneath the surface, a current of something that was not quite confusion and not quite concern. I have completed preliminary analysis of 14 vessels that I have classified as probable military platforms, based on their power output, orbital behavior, and formation patterns, he began. Gross dimensions vary. The largest are approximately 60% the displacement of a standard Alliance heavy cruiser. The smallest are roughly Corvette equivalent. They are uniformly, he paused, choosing his words, heavily constructed. The display showed a composite sensor image of one of the larger vessels. Even through the attenuation of the hull material, certain things were visible. The ship was angular, dense, with a profile that struck me, and, from the slight shift in posture around the table, several of the officers as well, as somehow wrong. Not damaged. Not alien in the way that unfamiliar aesthetics are alien. Wrong in the way that a tool designed for a purpose you do not understand is wrong. Every Alliance ship I had ever seen, in person or in records, had a certain economy of form. Hulls were light, elegant, designed to minimize mass while maximizing internal volume. This vessel was the opposite. It was thick, heavy, layered. Hull composition remains partially opaque, Soren continued. I can confirm multiple distinct layers of hull material, at minimum 3, possibly more. The outer layer appears to be a composite of unknown composition. Internal layers include what appears to be a dense metallic alloy. The overall hull thickness is, he checked his figures, approximately 4 to 5 times the hull thickness of a comparable Alliance vessel. Armor, Hathayan said. Physical armor, yes, extremely heavy physical armor. They also appear to have energy shielding. I am detecting field emitters consistent with shield generator technology, though the frequencies are not in our standard database. Soren brought up another display. This is where it becomes interesting. They have shields and heavy armor. In Alliance doctrine, these are redundant. You have one or the other. Shields for combat vessels, armor for stations and installations that cannot maneuver. These ships have both. Renathi spoke. That suggests either a design philosophy that has not yet optimized past the redundancy stage or a threat environment that necessitates both. The former is more likely, Soren said. Their shield technology appears less sophisticated than ours. The emitter patterns suggest earlier generation systems. They may simply not trust their shields enough to rely on them exclusively. The heavy armor is compensating for a perceived deficiency. I said nothing. I was not a tactical analyst, and the conversation was firmly in Soren's domain. But I noticed Renathi's choice of words, or a threat environment that necessitates both, and I filed it. Renathi was thinking about why. Soren was thinking about what. Power signatures, the captain said. Multiple reactor sources per vessel, Captain. The larger platforms show 3 to 4 distinct power signatures. The smaller vessels show 2. Soren frowned. This is consistent with either a modular reactor design or redundant power generation. Given the overall design philosophy we are observing, heavy, over-engineered, layered, I assess redundancy. They build backup systems rather than more reliable primary systems. Weapons? Energy weapon emplacements confirmed. I can identify what appear to be directed energy turrets, distributed across the hull in a pattern consistent with broadside combat doctrine. The energy signatures suggest output comparable to Alliance systems, though I cannot determine precise capability without observing them in operation. Soren shifted to another display. There are also a number of features I cannot identify. Circular openings in the hull, evenly spaced, behind what appears to be heavy shielding. Approximately 12 to 20 per vessel, depending on size class. No energy signature when passive. No obvious function in any ship design paradigm I am familiar with. Sensor arrays? Hathen suggested. Possible. The size and distribution would be unusual for sensors, but I cannot rule it out. They could also be atmospheric processing vents, cargo transfer ports, or equipment related to whatever industrial function these ships may serve, in addition to military roles. Many developing civilizations use dual-purpose vessels. Soren paused. I have flagged them as unknown hull features in the assessment. Without active scanning or closer observation, I cannot determine their function. The circular openings stared out from the display. A dozen dark mouths set into the hull of an overbuilt ship that the Alliance's best tactical officer could not fully read. I looked at them and felt something stir in the part of my mind that processed patterns. They were evenly spaced. They were behind heavy shielding. They were aligned along the ship's central axis. I did not know what they were. But something about their arrangement suggested purpose. Not the incidental purpose of a vent or a port, but the deliberate, calculated purpose of a system designed to do one specific thing extremely well. I kept this observation to myself. I was not a tactical analyst. I had no framework for it, but I recorded it in my private log. Footnote: the most significant scan data came not from the military vessels, but from the civilian traffic. The system was busy. Freighters, transports, what appeared to be survey vessels, and research platforms. Hundreds of ships moving between the planet, its moon, the orbital stations, and the outer system. The civilian vessels were easier to scan than the military ones. Their hull materials were lighter, their power signatures simpler, their movements predictable. Soren and Renathi compiled a comprehensive traffic analysis over 4 days of observation, mapping routes, estimating cargo capacity, cataloging vessel types. It was the civilian vessels that produced the first true anomaly. Captain, Desiree said. The navigator had been monitoring the traffic patterns, plotting courses, and projecting trajectories as part of the overall system survey. His voice had the particular quality that I had learned to associate with someone who has found something they cannot explain. Not alarm. Something quieter. I have been tracking a mid-size freighter on a standard outbound trajectory from the third planet. It accelerated on a heading consistent with the outer system. Nothing unusual. But its drive profile is absent. Absent, the captain repeated. The vessel is under power. It is maneuvering. But I am not detecting a drive signature consistent with any propulsion system in our database. No reaction mass expenditure. No field distortion consistent with an Alliance standard drive. No energy wake. The ship is moving, Captain, but I cannot determine how. Soren pulled the freighter scan data onto his own console. I watched him work, cross-referencing the power signatures, the mass readings, the velocity calculations. The frown that had been an intermittent presence on his face over the past several days deepened into something more permanent. Confirmed, he said. No identifiable drive system. The power output is there. The reactors are running, but none of it is being directed to propulsion in any configuration I recognize. There is no FTL drive. There is no sublight drive of any type in our database. The ship is moving under power that I cannot account for. Could the hull material be masking the drive signature? Hathan asked. It's possible, but a drive system generates specific secondary effects: gravitational distortion, particle emissions, thermal bloom, that should be detectable regardless of hull opacity. I am not seeing any of them. Soren looked at the captain. Sir, either this vessel is using a propulsion technology that produces none of the physical effects that all known drive systems produce, or it's using something that is not, strictly speaking, propulsion. The bridge was very quiet. Continue monitoring, the captain said. Track every vessel in the system. I want to know if this is unique to that freighter or... Captain. Tesseray's voice had changed. The quiet puzzlement was gone, replaced by something sharper. The freighter has altered heading. It is decelerating to a fixed point, approximately 400,000 kilometers above the ecliptic plane. There is nothing at those coordinates. No orbital body, no station, no debris field, empty space. Every officer on the bridge turned to the navigation display. The freighter, a small icon trailing a dotted, projected course, was slowing, orienting itself toward a point in the void that contained, by every instrument on the threshold, nothing at all. The freighter reached the point and held position. For approximately 11 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the sensors registered something that the threshold's analytical systems could not classify. A distortion, not electromagnetic, not gravitational in any standard sense, but something that bent the fabric of the sensor returns themselves. The region of space in front of the freighter changed. Not visually, we were too far away for optical resolution at that scale, but instrumentally, unmistakably, the geometry of space at those coordinates became something other than flat. The freighter moved forward. The distortion enveloped it. Both the freighter and the distortion vanished. The sensor returns flattened. The coordinates were empty again, empty as though nothing had ever been there. The bridge was silent for a long time. Tesseray spoke first. He was a navigator. He understood space, the shape of it, the rules of it, the mathematics that governed how things moved through it. What he had just witnessed was a violation of those mathematics so fundamental that his voice, when he found it, was barely above a whisper. That was not a drive. The ship did not move through space. He looked at his instruments, then at the captain, then back at his instruments, as though hoping one of them would offer an explanation the other could not. "Captain, the space moved. They opened I don't have a word for it, a discontinuity, a bridge between 2 points. The ship entered it, and both the ship and the bridge ceased to exist at those coordinates." "Where did it go?" Voren asked. His voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who understood that the next few minutes would determine the shape of everything that followed. "I don't know, Captain. The destination was not in this system. The ship did not emerge anywhere within our sensor range. It could be anywhere." Tesserae paused. "Sir, if this technology is what I believe it is, then the absence of drive systems on their ships is not a deficiency. They do not need drives. They do not cross the space between 2 points. They remove the space entirely." I was watching the captain when Tesserae said this, and for the first time since I had come aboard the threshold, I saw something on Voren's face that I could read without ambiguity. It was not fear. The Rithani military does not cultivate fear in its officers. It was reassessment, the rapid, involuntary recalculation that occurs when a fundamental assumption has been destroyed and the mind has not yet built a replacement. He recovered in seconds. "How many ships in this system have we observed without identifiable drive signatures?" Soren answered immediately. He had already checked. "All of them, Captain." Another silence. "Shorter than the last, but heavier. All of them," Voren repeated. "Every vessel we have scanned, military and civilian, none of them have a drive system I can identify. I had attributed this to hull opacity masking the drive signatures. I now believe that was incorrect. They do not have drives because they use—" Soren gestured at the empty coordinates where the freighter had been. "That," the captain turned to me. It was the first time he had looked at me during the entire sequence, and his eyes carried a weight they had not carried before. "Lieutenant, is there anything in the Sathari observation logs that describes this technology? Anything that would have predicted this development?" "No, Captain. The Sathari's final observation was conducted before the species had achieved sustained spaceflight. Their technological trajectory at the time of the quarantine gave no indication of I stopped, because that was not entirely true. The Sathari had not predicted this specific technology, but they had predicted the species. Carathan had watched them split the atom and written, 'The question is what they will become.' The Sathari did not predict the specific technology," I said, "but the observation record consistently documented a species that developed capabilities beyond the observer's projections. The pattern is not the technology itself. The pattern is that each observation found the species further along than the previous observation had predicted." The captain looked at me for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the view screen. "Soren," he said, "reassess the military vessels in light of this. Specifically, if their transit capability allows instantaneous deployment across interstellar distances, what does that mean for the defensive and offensive capability of their fleet?" "It means there is no meaningful distinction between the two, Captain," Soren said quietly. "Any ship, anywhere in their network can be anywhere else in their network within seconds. Their entire fleet is their defensive force and their offensive force simultaneously. There is no reserve. There is no deployment time. There is no warning." "And the circular hull features?" "Unknown, Captain. Still unknown." Soren's voice was steady, but something in the steadiness sounded like it was being maintained by effort. "But given what we have just observed, I am no longer comfortable attributing them to atmospheric processing." Voren nodded. a single, precise motion. "We stay on station," he said. "Silent running continues. I want 48 hours of observation data before we make any decisions. Compile everything: traffic patterns, fleet composition, technology assessment, population estimates, everything we can gather passively." He looked around the bridge. "No one outside this room discusses what we have observed. That is a direct order. Dismissed to stations." The officers returned to their consoles. The bridge settled into the tense, focused silence of people performing their duties while their understanding of the universe rearranged itself around them. I remained at my station and began compiling my own assessment. Not tactical, not strategic, but historical. The Sithari had watched this species for 74,000 years. They had watched it survive a supervolcano, invent agriculture, build and collapse civilizations, develop nuclear weapons, engineer a plague, and lose 3/4 of its population. And then the Watchers had looked away for 1,500 years. In that time, the species had learned to fold space. I thought of Carathan's question, "What will they become?" And for the first time, I understood why the Sithari had been afraid. Not because the species was dangerous, though it was. Not because it was unpredictable, though it was that too. The Sithari had been afraid because this species did not develop along a curve. It developed along an exponential. Every catastrophe accelerated it. Every collapse compressed the next cycle of rebuilding into a shorter span at a higher level, with capabilities that exceeded the previous cycle by margins that grew wider each time. The Sithari had seen the trajectory. They had plotted the curve, and they had sealed the file and built a fence around the system because they understood, with the mathematical clarity that was their greatest gift, that a curve like that does not flatten, it steepens.
You have reached the end of Part 1. Please proceed to Part 2.
Author's note: the rest of Idrani's story is coming soon. AI tools were used to help with the writing, narration, and visual presentation of the Idrani account. But the story itself, the central plot, characters, themes, and direction came from me, a human author. I used AI as a creative and production tool to help refine the prose, develop scenes, give the characters a voice, and bring the world I imagined to life. It did not replace the ideas behind the story. It helped me turn those ideas into something I could share. Between the demands of my work and home life, I would not have been able to complete a project of this scale on my own. These tools made it possible for me to create the book and produce this audio-video edition without waiting for some distant point when I might finally have enough free time. Thank you for listening and for joining Idrani on the first part of her journey. Part 2 is coming soon.